Welcome, fellow wanderer of the endless seas, to the extraordinary chronicle of the seven warlords of the sea, a collection of legends whose stories have shaped the very fabric of pirate history. Tonight, we delve into the complex tapestries of those who walked the knife's edge between piracy and governmental sanction, each carrying dreams, ambitions, and secrets that would reshape the world. From the haunting elegance of Dracul Mihawk to the tragic nobility of Bartholomew Kuma, these are tales of power wielded in shadow and light. So settle in, let the rhythm of distant waves carry you into peaceful slumber as we explore the complete histories of the Shichibukai, their origins, their triumphs, their falls, and their lasting impact on the world that both feared and revered them. In the vast tapestry of pirate legend, where countless souls have sought glory upon the endless seas, few names command the reverence and fear that follows in the wake of Dracul Mihawk. Known throughout the world as the greatest swordsman who ever lived, his very presence transforms the atmosphere of any gathering, causing even the most hardened warriors to lower their voices in acknowledgement of something approaching the divine made manifest in human form. The golden eyes that earned him the epithet Hawkeyes see beyond the immediate moment, perceiving truths that lesser minds cannot fathom, reading the intentions of opponents before those intentions have fully formed in their own consciousness. His story begins not in the grand theatres of battle that would later showcase his legendary prowess, but in the quieter corners of the world, where a child first grasped a wooden sword and discovered within himself a hunger that could never be satisfied by ordinary pursuits. The island of his birth remains shrouded in mystery, its name whispered only in the most secretive circles, though some scholars suggest it lies somewhere in the treacherous waters of the Grand Line, where the very air seems charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. What is certain is that from his earliest memories, young Dracul possessed an intensity of focus that set him apart from other children, his amber eyes already holding depths that suggested wisdom beyond his years. The sword that would become his constant companion was not born from legendary forges or inherited from fallen heroes, but emerged from the crucible of his own determination and the mysterious processes that transform ordinary steel into something transcendent. Yoru, the black blade that would become synonymous with absolute mastery, began its existence as a weapon, no different from countless others that populated the world's battlefields and training grounds. Yet in the hands of someone whose understanding of swordsmanship approached the mystical, ordinary metal, became something that defied conventional understanding, its surface drinking in light until it reflected nothing but the void itself. The transformation of Yoru from common steel to supreme-grade blade occurred through years of constant use by a master whose dedication to his craft bordered on religious devotion. Each battle fought with proper technique and genuine respect for the art of swordsmanship contributed to the weapon's evolution, the blade gradually absorbing the spiritual energy of its wielder until it became permanently infused with the kind of haki that most swordsmen could only dream of achieving. The process was neither quick nor easy, requiring not just technical skill but a depth of character that few possessed, the kind of integrity that refused to compromise, even when expedience might have provided easier paths to victory. The young man who would become the world's greatest swordsman did not achieve his status through inheritance or political maneuvering, but through the simple yet profound approach of challenging anyone whose reputation suggested they might provide worthy combat. His early duels were conducted with a courtesy that spoke to noble upbringing, each opponent treated with respect, regardless of their ultimate fate, victory achieved through superior skill rather than dirty tactics or overwhelming force. Those who survived encounters with the rising swordsman spoke of his almost supernatural ability to read their techniques before they were fully executed, his counterattacks arriving with precision that seemed to anticipate their movements by several steps. It was during these formative years of establishing his reputation that Mihawk first encountered red-haired Shanks, then still a member of the Roger Pirates, but already displaying the kind of swordsmanship that marked him as someone special, even among that legendary crew. Their initial meeting occurred on a small island in the New World, where both had arrived in pursuit of rumors about an ancient sword supposedly hidden in forgotten ruins, though neither would later remember whether they had actually discovered the weapon or if their jewel had been worth more than any treasure they might have claimed. The friendship that developed between these two masters of the blade was unlike anything either had experienced before, built not on shared hardship or common enemies, but on mutual recognition of excellence that transcended competitive rivalry. Their duels became legendary events that drew spectators from across the Grand Line, each bout pushing both fighters to heights they had never reached before, their techniques evolving through constant challenge and response, until they achieved levels of mastery that seemed to operate according to principles beyond normal human understanding. For years, their battles served as entertainment for those bold enough to witness them, while simultaneously driving both men toward perfection that existed just beyond their current abilities, each victory by one spurring the other to develop new techniques or refine existing approaches until their next encounter might tip the balance in a different direction. The wine they shared after each duel was as important as the combat itself. Conversations about philosophy and purpose, revealing depths of character that their swords had only hinted at during battle. The development of friendship that would endure long after their formal rivalry had ended. The cessation of their duels came not through decisive victory by either party, but through Shanks's sacrifice of his left arm to save young Luffy from the Lord of the Coast, a choice that fundamentally altered the dynamic between the two greatest swordsmen of their generation. Mihawk's reaction to this news was complex and layered. Disappointment at losing his greatest rival mixing with respect for the nobility of spirit that would choose a child's safety over personal glory, understanding that the man who could make such a sacrifice had achieved a kind of victory that transcended any possible outcome of their sword fights. The loneliness that followed the end of his rivalry with Shanks led Mihawk to accept the world government's offer to become one of the 7 warlords of the sea, though his motivation had nothing to do with the legal protection or political advantages that the position provided. Instead, he saw the title as a tool that would bring interesting opponents to his attention, pirates whose reputations had grown large enough to suggest they might provide the kind of challenges that had once been supplied by regular duels with red-haired Shanks, though he held little hope that anyone could truly replace what had been lost. His tenure as a warlord was marked by a kind of disinterested professionalism that frustrated marine officials who had hoped to direct his considerable abilities toward their own strategic objectives. Mihawk fulfilled his obligations to the letter, while maintaining complete independence in choosing which summons to answer and which enemies were worth his personal attention. His participation in events like the Marineford War, motivated more by curiosity about the participants than any loyalty to the world government or opposition to Whitebeard's forces. The encounter with Roronoa Zoro at the floating restaurant Barati marked the first time in years that Mihawk had faced an opponent whose dedication to swordsmanship matched his own, though the vast difference in their current abilities made the outcome inevitable from the moment their blades first crossed. What impressed the world's greatest swordsman was not Zoro's technique, which remained crude despite obvious natural talent, but the purity of his commitment to his art and his willingness to accept death rather than abandon his dreams or betray his captain's trust. The wound that Mihawk delivered to Zoro's chest was calculated to be severe enough to demonstrate the gulf between their current abilities while remaining survivable for someone with sufficient willpower to endure the recovery process. a gift that few would have recognized as such, but which represented the closest thing to encouragement that the world's greatest swordsman was capable of offering. His prediction that they would meet again carried the weight of prophecy, recognition that he had found someone who possessed the fundamental character necessary to eventually achieve true mastery if he proved capable of the growth that such achievement demanded. The years that followed brought Mihawk occasional encounters with other swordsmen who imagined themselves worthy of challenge, though most proved disappointing in ways that reinforced his understanding of how rare true dedication to the art had become in an age where devil fruit powers and advanced weaponry provided shortcuts to strength that bypassed the spiritual development that genuine mastery required. His castle on Kuraigana Island became both fortress and training ground, its Gothic architecture reflecting the melancholy that had settled over its owner like morning mist that never quite burned away under the sun. The zombie swordsman Ryuma presented an interesting diversion during the Thriller Bark incident, his animated corpse retaining enough of its legendary skill to provide entertainment if not genuine challenge, though Mihawk's interest lay more in observing how death might affect technique than in any hope of finding a worthy opponent. The brief duel served to remind him that even legends of the past had possessed limitations that time and reverence had obscured, their reputations perhaps inflated by storytellers who preferred dramatic narratives to accurate historical accounts. Zoro's arrival on Kuraigana Island during the 2-year training period provided Mihawk with something he had not experienced in decades, a student whose potential justified the effort required to shape raw talent into refined skill. The swordsman who had once been content with solitary existence found himself reluctantly invested in another's development, his natural teaching ability emerging despite years of self-imposed isolation from the kinds of relationships that such investment required. The training he provided was harsh by any standard, though its severity was born from understanding rather than cruelty. Each exercise designed to address specific weaknesses while building the foundational strength that advanced techniques would eventually require. Mihawk's approach emphasized not just physical conditioning but mental discipline, the development of focus that could maintain perfect clarity even under the extreme stress of life or death combat, the kind of spiritual equilibrium that allowed true masters to perform impossible feats through will made manifest in precisely controlled action. The relationship that developed between master and student was complex and layered, marked by mutual respect, that grew despite their vastly different personalities and approaches to swordsmanship. Zoro's straightforward determination, providing an interesting contrast to Mihawk's more philosophical bent. Their conversations during brief rests between training sessions revealed depths of understanding about the nature of strength and the responsibilities that came with pursuing ultimate mastery, topics that Mihawk had previously explored only in solitary contemplation. The dissolution of the warlord system came as no surprise to someone who had always understood that political arrangements were temporary conveniences that could be abandoned whenever they became inconvenient for those in power, though the timing suggested that world events were accelerating towards some kind of climactic confrontation that would reshape the existing order entirely. Mihawk's reaction to losing his legal protection was characteristically pragmatic, neither angry at the betrayal nor particularly concerned about the increased marine attention that would inevitably follow. The formation of Cross Guild represented a masterful strategic response to changed circumstances, though Mihawk's participation was motivated less by desire for the organization's stated goals than by appreciation for the elegant way it had turned apparent disadvantage into significant leverage against their common enemies. His partnership with Crocodile brought together two of the most formidable former warlords under circumstances that allowed both to pursue their individual objectives while benefiting from their combined reputation and resources. Buggy's unexpected elevation to the nominal leadership of Cross Guild provided endless amusement to someone whose sense of humor had been sharpened by years of observing the absurdities that power created in those who possessed it, without wisdom to guide its application. The clown's genuine terror at finding himself technically in command of two legendary pirates spoke to the kind of cosmic irony that Mihawk had learned to appreciate, though he maintained enough respect for Buggy's survival instincts to trust that their figurehead leader would avoid making decisions that might endanger the organization's effectiveness. The hunt for the One Piece that Cross Guild had officially joined represented something of a return to his younger self's approach to challenge-seeking. Though Mihawk's motivation remained focused on the interesting opponents such a quest would inevitably attract, rather than any desire for whatever treasure awaited at journey's end. His understanding of Gold D, Roger's legacy suggested that the ultimate prize was likely something that could only be appreciated by someone who had achieved it through their own efforts rather than inherited it from others, making the journey itself more valuable than any conceivable destination. The inevitable confrontation with Zoro that lay somewhere in their shared future carried emotional weight that Mihawk rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. The prospect of facing a student who had grown into genuine rival representing both vindication of his teaching methods and the bittersweet recognition that success would mean the end of their current relationship. The duel they would eventually fight would serve multiple purposes. Final examination for student who had outgrown need for instruction, test of teaching methods that had shaped a master from promising material, and personal validation that his legacy would continue through someone worthy of inheriting it. His dreams, though rarely spoken of even in solitary moments, centered not on conquest or treasure, but on the possibility of finding someone whose mastery could match his own, the kind of perfect opponent who could provide the ultimate test of everything he had learned and developed over decades of dedicated pursuit of impossible perfection. Zoro represented the best hope for achieving this dream, though Mihawk's understanding of swordsmanship's highest levels made him aware that even success in creating a worthy successor would bring its own form of loneliness, the isolation of someone whose achievements placed them beyond the reach of ordinary companionship. The philosophy that had guided his entire approach to swordsmanship emphasized not just technical excellence, but spiritual development. The recognition that true mastery required integration of physical skill with mental clarity and emotional balance that few possessed the patience to achieve. His teaching methods reflected this understanding, each lesson designed to challenge not just Zoro's abilities but his character, the kind of comprehensive development that would produce not just a powerful swordsman, but someone capable of using such power responsibly. Standing now at the pinnacle of his art, Dracul Mihawk remains what he has always been, a seeker of perfection in a world that rarely rewards such dedication, a guardian of traditions that connect the present to a past, when honor and skill mattered more than political advantage or inherited power. His golden eyes continue to pierce through deception and pretense to perceive the truth that lies beneath surface appearances, his black blade ready to cut through whatever obstacles might stand between him and the ultimate expression of everything swordsmanship could become, when practiced with absolute dedication to its highest ideals. The sands of time carry within their infinite grains the stories of those who dared to dream beyond the boundaries that others accepted as immutable. And among these tales of ambition and transformation, few shine with the complex brilliance of Sir Crocodile's journey from promising rookie pirate to one of the most feared warlords of the sea. His story begins not in the harsh deserts that would later become synonymous with his power, but in the bustling ports and crowded streets of a kingdom where a young man first glimpsed the vast possibilities that lay beyond the horizon, his dark eyes already calculating the steps that would be necessary to claim a place among the legends whose names echoed across the oceans. The circumstances of his early life remained shrouded in mystery, though fragments of information suggest origins that were neither privileged nor particularly disadvantaged. The kind of middle ground that often produces individuals capable of seeing both the heights they might achieve and the depths they must avoid falling into. What emerges clearly from the scattered accounts of those who knew him during his formative years is a mind that operated with mathematical precision, even when dealing with matters of emotion and loyalty. His ability to compartmentalize feelings and strategic considerations, marking him as someone destined for either greatness or catastrophic failure, depending on the choices he would make when ambition encountered reality. His initial forays into piracy followed patterns that had been established by countless others who sought their fortunes on the high seas, though even in these early adventures there were signs of the methodical approach that would later characterize his most ambitious schemes. Unlike many of his contemporaries who relied on brute force or charismatic leadership to achieve their goals, young Crocodile demonstrated an understanding of systems and structures that allowed him to anticipate how various factions would respond to different types of pressure, his strategies often succeeding through careful manipulation of existing tensions, rather than direct confrontation with superior forces. The devil fruit that would define his combat capabilities and provide the foundation for his eventual rise to prominence came into his possession through circumstances that he would later describe as fortuitous, though careful observers might have detected the subtle machinations that had guided events toward their seemingly inevitable conclusion. The Sunasuna no Mi transformed his body into living sand while granting him dominion over one of nature's most abundant yet versatile elements, power that could manifest as gentle erosion, wearing away the strongest fortifications, or devastating sandstorms that stripped flesh from bone with impartial efficiency. Mastering the abilities granted by his Logia-type fruit required not just understanding of its mechanical functions, but philosophical acceptance of what it meant to become something elemental and dispersed, his consciousness learning to maintain cohesion, even when his physical form had been scattered across vast areas by enemy attacks or his own strategic choices. The process of achieving such integration between mind and transformed matter pushed him toward a kind of existential detachment that would prove both asset and liability in the years to come. His growing ability to distance himself emotionally from immediate circumstances, enhancing his strategic thinking, while gradually eroding the kinds of connections that might have provided anchors to more conventional forms of human being. Meaning, the encounter with Whitebeard that would become a defining moment in his early career occurred during an era when the future Yonko was still establishing his reputation as someone capable of challenging the existing order, though his strength had already grown to levels that made casual confrontation with him extremely dangerous for anyone who had not achieved similar heights of power. The specific details of their battle remain known only to the participants, but its outcome left Crocodile with both a greater understanding of what true strength looked like when wielded without restraint, and a determination to find alternative paths to achieving his goals that did not require matching such overwhelming force through conventional means. The defeat he suffered at Whitebeard's hands was comprehensive and humbling, though the lessons it provided would prove invaluable in shaping his subsequent approach to conflicts that could not be avoided through planning and misdirection. The experience taught him that individual power, no matter how great, remained vulnerable to opponents who possessed not just superior abilities, but the kind of indomitable will that could overcome tactical advantages through sheer refusal to accept defeat, insights that would inform his later decisions about when to engage directly and when to seek victory through less obvious methods. Recovery from such a definitive loss required not just physical healing but psychological reconstruction, the rebuilding of confidence that had been shattered by confrontation with someone whose strength operated on scales he had not previously imagined possible. The process was neither quick nor pleasant, involving honest assessment of his limitations and careful consideration of which aspects of his approach to piracy would need to be modified if he hoped to achieve the ambitions that still burned within his chest, despite the evidence that conventional paths to power might remain forever beyond his reach. The invitation to join the 7 warlords of the sea came at a moment when such official recognition would provide exactly the kind of legitimacy and resources that his evolving plans required, though his acceptance was motivated by strategic considerations rather than any desire for government approval or legal protection from marine pursuit. The position offered access to information networks and political connections that would have taken decades to develop through independent effort, while the reputation that came with warlord status would open doors that might otherwise have remained permanently closed to someone whose methods operated in the shadowy spaces between legal and criminal activity. His early years as a warlord were marked by careful cultivation of relationships with both government officials and underworld figures, his natural charisma and demonstrated competence earning him allies whose assistance would prove crucial when his grander schemes required coordination between multiple factions whose normal interactions were characterized by suspicion, competition. The persona he developed during this period emphasized reliability and reasonable discourse over the more flamboyant approaches favored by some of his fellow warlords. His understanding that consistent performance of relatively modest requests would build trust that could later be leveraged for more significant favors. The conception of Baroque works represented the culmination of years spent observing how power structures functioned in practice rather than theory. His organization designed to exploit weaknesses he had identified in both government agencies and criminal enterprises through careful application of principles that most people never consciously considered. The use of code names and compartmentalized information networks prevented any individual member from possessing enough knowledge to compromise the entire operation, while the promise of eventual rewards maintained loyalty even among those who might have questioned the morality of their specific assignments. The recruitment process for Baroque works demonstrated Crocodile's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and motivation. His ability to identify individuals whose particular skills and psychological profiles made them suitable for roles within his larger strategy, while ensuring that their personal goals aligned sufficiently with organizational objectives to minimize the risk of betrayal born from conflicting interests. Each agent was chosen not just for their combat abilities or specialized knowledge, but for character traits that made them reliable components in a machine whose ultimate purpose remained hidden from all but its architect. The structure he created was elegant in its simplicity, yet devastatingly effective in practice, with paired agents whose complementary abilities created tactical units capable of handling a wide variety of missions, while the hierarchical organization ensured that information flowed upward through carefully controlled channels that prevented unauthorized horizontal communication between different operational levels. The Mr. and Miss system provided clear advancement paths that motivated ambitious members, while the mystery surrounding higher-ranking positions maintained the kind of intrigue that kept people invested in organizational success, even when immediate rewards seemed insufficient. Operation Utopia, the scheme that would consume years of planning and vast resources, while ultimately determining his fate, emerged from Crocodile's analysis of political vulnerabilities within the Alabaster Kingdom, and his recognition that the ancient weapon, Pluton, represented the kind of overwhelming force that could compensate for his inability to match the raw strength of opponents like Whitebeard through conventional development. The plan required orchestrating a civil war that would destabilize the kingdom sufficiently to justify outside intervention while positioning himself as both the crisis's ultimate cause and its apparent solution. The manipulation of King Cobra and Princess Vivi through the use of his Mr. Bay, two agents' shape-shifting abilities, represented perhaps the most morally questionable aspect of an operation that was already ethically compromised. His willingness to exploit family relationships and national loyalty for personal gain, revealing the extent to which his philosophical detachment had evolved into something approaching genuine callousness toward human suffering that served his purposes. The false flag operations that turned citizens against each other demonstrated tactical brilliance while highlighting the moral vacuum at the center of his worldview. The rebellion that he fostered through careful distribution of weapons and strategic assassination of moderate voices who might have found peaceful solutions to manufactured grievances, created exactly the kind of chaos that would justify the intervention he planned to provide, though the human cost of such manipulation remained something he processed as necessary overhead, rather than tragedy deserving consideration in its own right. His ability to maintain emotional distance from the consequences of his actions became both strategic asset and personal liability as the operation approached its climactic phases. The confrontation with the Straw Hat Pirates that would ultimately determine the success or failure of years of preparation caught him at a moment when victory seemed assured, and his transformation into one of the world's most powerful individuals appeared to be merely a matter of time and proper execution of final steps that had been rehearsed countless times in his imagination. Monkey D. Luffy's arrival in Alabasta represented the kind of unpredictable variable that even the most sophisticated planning could not account for, a wildcard whose methods operated according to principles that defied conventional strategic analysis. The battles that followed tested not just Crocodile's combat abilities, but his fundamental understanding of what strength meant and how it could be defeated by opponents who possessed neither superior firepower nor more sophisticated tactics. Luffy's victory over him serving as harsh reminder that individual will could overcome systematic advantages when that will was supported by connections to others that provided meaning deeper than personal ambition. The defeat was comprehensive and public, destroying not just his immediate plans but the carefully constructed reputation that had taken decades to build. The imprisonment in Impel Down that followed his capture might have represented the end of his story, were it not for circumstances that transformed incarceration into opportunity for reflection and eventual alliance with former enemies, whose goals had become aligned with his own through the curious mathematics of mutual necessity. The underwater prison's harsh conditions and psychological pressures created environment where pretense became impossible to maintain, forcing honest self-assessment that revealed aspects of his character that years of strategic thinking had obscured beneath layers of calculated behavior. The alliance with Monkey D. Luffy, during the Impel Down breakout, required setting aside personal pride and accepting cooperation with someone who had previously humiliated him, though the practical benefits of such partnership outweighed emotional considerations when survival itself became uncertain. The temporary truce revealed unexpected compatibility between their approaches to problem-solving when their objectives aligned. Crocodile's strategic planning complementing Luffy's intuitive responses to immediate challenges in ways that created possibilities neither could have achieved independently. The Marineford War provided stage for his return to prominence, though his motivations for participating remained characteristically complex and layered. His apparent support for Whitebeard's rescue mission, serving multiple purposes that included both genuine desire to repay debts and strategic positioning for whatever new order might emerge from the conflict's aftermath. His combat performance during the war demonstrated that his abilities had not diminished during imprisonment, while his tactical decisions showed growth in understanding that pure self-interest was insufficient foundation for sustained success in a world where alliances and enmities could shift with bewildering speed. The formation of Cross Guild represented perhaps the most sophisticated expression of lessons learned through decades of success and failure. His partnership with Mihawk and Buggy creating organization that combined their respective strengths while compensating for individual weaknesses in ways that made their collective influence greater than the sum of their separate capabilities. His role as the organization's tactical mind provided outlet for planning abilities that had been refined through experience, while the shared leadership structure prevented the kind of isolation that had contributed to his previous downfall. The relationship with Mihawk, built on mutual respect between former warlords who understood both the advantages and limitations of their previous positions, created foundation for cooperation that transcended mere convenience to approach something resembling genuine partnership between equals who could appreciate each other's capabilities without feeling threatened by them. Their complementary skills in strategic planning and individual combat created tactical possibilities that neither could access independently, while their shared experience of government betrayal provided common ground that went deeper than professional necessity. Buggy's unexpected elevation to the nominal leadership position created amusing complications that Crocodile navigated with characteristic pragmatism. His understanding that public perception often mattered more than private reality, allowing him to work effectively within a structure that placed a former rival in apparent command while maintaining actual influence over organizational decisions through more subtle channels. The arrangement satisfied his need for strategic control, while providing the kind of misdirection that had always been central to his most successful operations. The hunt for the One Piece that Cross Guild had officially joined represented return to the kind of grand ambition that had always driven his most significant undertakings, though his motivations remained characteristically complex and possibly opaque even to himself. The pursuit of ultimate treasure, serving as vehicle for achieving influence and position that might prove more valuable than whatever material rewards awaited at journey's end. His understanding of power structures suggested that whoever claimed the title of Pirate King would necessarily become central figure in whatever new order emerged from the current world's eventual transformation. The lessons learned through decades of triumph and failure had refined his approach to leadership and strategy, his current methods reflecting hard-won wisdom about the importance of genuine allies and the limitations of systems that depended entirely on fear or self-interest to maintain coherence. The man who had once sought to rule through manipulation and isolation had evolved into someone capable of building relationships based on mutual benefit and shared respect, though the calculating mind that had always driven his decisions remained as sharp as ever beneath the more collaborative exterior. His current position within Cross Guild provided platform for pursuing ambitions that had been temporarily derailed but never abandoned. The combination of resources, reputation, and allies creating possibilities for achieving goals that had once seemed beyond reach through any conceivable means. The Desert King, who had once sought to reshape a single kingdom through elaborate deception, now found himself positioned to influence the fate of the entire world through more direct methods. His evolution from solitary schemer to collaborative strategist, representing growth that few would have predicted based on his earlier behavior patterns. Standing now at the threshold of conflicts that would determine the shape of the world's future, so Crocodile embodied the complex interplay between ambition and wisdom that characterized those who had learned from their failures without abandoning their dreams, his golden hook catching light as his mind continued calculating the moves that would be necessary to claim victory in games whose stakes transcended anything he had previously imagined possible. In the rarefied halls of Mariéchoir, where gods among mortals once walked with casual indifference to the suffering their whims created, a child was born who would one day embody both the absolute corruption of inherited power and the twisted nobility that could emerge when such privilege was stripped away through forces beyond anyone's control. Don Quixote do Flamingo entered the world as a celestial dragon, heir to bloodlines that traced their authority back to the founding of the world government itself. His earliest breaths drawn in chambers where the very air seemed thick with the weight of 8 centuries spent, believing that some humans were fundamentally superior to others by virtue of nothing more than the circumstances of their birth. The Don Quixote family had long been considered among the most prominent of the world nobles, their influence extending through networks of political connection and economic control that shaped the destinies of entire kingdoms without those affected even understanding the source of their misfortune. Young Doflamingo's father, Don Quixote Homing, possessed the kind of idealistic streak that occasionally emerged in individuals whose comfort had never been threatened by the realities that their lifestyle imposed upon others. His growing discomfort with the casual cruelty that surrounded him, eventually crystallizing into a decision that would destroy everything his son had ever known or expected from life. The choice to renounce their celestial dragon status and attempt to live as ordinary humans among those they had previously ruled represented either profound moral awakening or catastrophic naivety, depending on one's perspective, though the practical consequences remained devastating regardless of the nobility or foolishness of the motivations that drove such unprecedented action. Homing's belief that his family could simply integrate into normal society without facing retribution for centuries of systematic oppression demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of how deeply the hatred for celestial dragons had penetrated into the consciousness of those who had suffered under their rule. The exodus from Mariéchoir transformed young Doflamingo from a child who had never questioned his right to absolute authority over others into a refugee whose former status made him a target for every person who had ever dreamed of revenge against the system that had crushed their hopes beneath the weight of inherited privilege. The world beyond the Holy Land proved harsh and unforgiving to those who had never learned to fend for themselves, the basic skills of survival having been deemed unnecessary for beings whose every need had been anticipated and fulfilled by servants whose lives held no value beyond their utility to their masters. The suffering that followed was both physical and psychological, hunger and cold, representing new experiences for children who had previously existed in environments where such discomforts were literally inconceivable. But perhaps more devastating was the gradual understanding that their former status had been built upon the systematic brutalization of people who were fundamentally no different from themselves. The cognitive dissonance created by this realization manifested differently in each family member, Homing's guilt deepening into something approaching self-destructive penitence, while his wife retreated into denial that eventually consumed her sanity entirely. Doflamingo's response to their changed circumstances revealed aspects of his character that might never have emerged had he remained safely insulated within the protective bubble of celestial dragon privilege. His natural charisma and intelligence adapting to new realities with disturbing efficiency, while his moral framework underwent transformations that would shape every decision he made for the remainder of his life. The child who had once commanded absolute obedience through inherited authority learned to achieve similar results through manipulation and intimidation. His understanding that fear could substitute for respect providing foundation for approaches to leadership that would serve him well in contexts far removed from the rarefied atmosphere of his birth. The death of his mother, from illness that could have been easily treated had they retained access to the medical care available to world nobles, served as harsh lesson in how quickly circumstances could change and how little protection previous status provided when forces beyond one's control decided to reassert natural order. The grief and rage that accompanied this loss were complicated by understanding that her death was indirect, consequence of choices that had been made with good intentions, the kind of moral complexity that would characterize most of Doflamingo's subsequent relationships with concepts like justice and responsibility. The moment when Doflamingo's conqueror's haki first manifested represented both awakening to power that transcended his previous understanding of what was possible, and recognition that he possessed qualities that marked him as fundamentally different from ordinary humans, regardless of whatever legal or social status might be assigned to his current circumstances. The ability to impose his will directly upon others provided both validation of his belief in his inherent superiority and practical tool for beginning the long journey back toward the kind of influence he had lost when his family abandoned their position among the world nobles. The murder of his father represented the definitive rejection of the idealism that had led to their downfall. Doflamingo's decision to execute the man whose choices had destroyed their lives, serving multiple purposes that included both practical demonstration of his commitment to reclaiming power and psychological severing of connections to the worldview that had valued abstract principles over concrete results. The head that he intended to present to the celestial dragons as proof of his worthiness to return to Mariéjois became symbol of his willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone in pursuit of objectives that he considered more important than conventional morality. The rejection he received when attempting to buy his way back into the world nobles through patricide provided crucial insight into how systems of power actually functioned beneath their publicly proclaimed principles. The discovery that birth meant more than demonstrated loyalty, teaching him lessons about the arbitrary nature of authority that would inform his approach to challenging established orders throughout his subsequent career. The humiliation of being dismissed, despite having proven his commitment through ultimate sacrifice, crystallized his understanding that respect could not be earned through supplication, but would have to be seized through demonstrations of strength that could not be ignored. The formation of the Don Quixote pirates began as much from necessity as ambition. His recruitment of individuals whose backgrounds and motivations aligned with his own creating organization that was held together by shared understanding of what it meant to be rejected by the systems that claimed to represent justice and order. Each member of his growing crew brought skills and perspectives that complemented his own abilities, while their collective loyalty was secured through combination of genuine affection and realistic understanding of what alternatives were available to people whose life experiences had marked them as unsuitable for conventional society. The development of his string fruit abilities required not just mastery of technical applications, but philosophical integration of what it meant to control others through invisible connections that they might never recognize or understand. His growing expertise with these powers serving as metaphor for broader approaches to influence that relied on manipulation of circumstances rather than direct confrontation with superior forces. The strings that emerged from his fingers could cut through steel or control human bodies like marionettes, but their most significant applications lay in the subtle ways they could reshape entire political landscapes through careful adjustment of relationships between key individuals. The rise through the ranks of the underworld required navigation of complex networks where reputation meant everything and weakness was punished with swift elimination. Though Doflamingo's combination of celestial dragon education and street-hardened pragmatism provided advantages that most competitors could not match in environments where both intellectual sophistication and willingness to embrace violence were necessary for survival. His code name of Joker reflected both his unpredictable nature and his role as wildcard, capable of disrupting established patterns through actions that others could neither predict nor adequately prepare for. The acquisition of warlord status came through combination of demonstrated competence in tasks that the world government preferred to handle through unofficial channels and strategic application of knowledge about Celestial Dragon, vulnerabilities that he had gained through his unique background, his blackmail of the organization that had rejected his attempts to return to their ranks, representing both practical achievement and deeply personal satisfaction. The legal protection that came with official recognition as government-sanctioned pirate provided foundation for expanding operations that required appearance of legitimacy, while the reputation that accompanied such status opened doors that would have remained closed to someone operating entirely outside established systems. The tragedy that befell his brother Rocinante revealed the depths of Doflamingo's capacity for both love and hatred, his genuine affection for the sibling who had chosen to remain loyal to their family's original values, coming into direct conflict with practical necessities created by Rocinante's work as undercover marine agent. The discovery that someone he trusted above all others had been systematically betraying him to the organization that represented everything he had learned to hate created psychological wounds that would never fully heal, while simultaneously eliminating the last connection he maintained to the idealism that had once characterized his family's worldview. The execution of Rocinante represented not just elimination of security threat, but symbolic severing of final ties to the person he had once been before circumstances had forced him to choose between principles and survival. His tears, as he pulled the trigger, speaking to emotional cost of decisions that his rational mind recognized as inevitable, given the realities of their situation. The child Trafalgar Law who witnessed this fratricide would carry the trauma of that moment throughout his subsequent development, though at the time, Doflamingo's focus remained centered on implications for his own operations, rather than concern for psychological damage being inflicted upon someone whose loyalty had not yet been tested through comparable trials. The conquest of Dressrosa required orchestration of events that demonstrated both his strategic sophistication and his willingness to sacrifice countless innocent lives in pursuit of objectives that served his personal agenda, while providing useful services to more powerful allies whose protection would be necessary for maintaining his position. The transformation of King Riku from beloved monarch into apparent tyrant through manipulation of circumstances and perception revealed mastery of techniques that went far beyond simple application of devil fruit powers to encompass comprehensive understanding of how societies functioned and what psychological buttons could be pressed to achieve desired responses from large populations. The sugar-induced transformation of resistors into toys represented perhaps the most horrifying application of devil fruit abilities ever recorded. The systematic erasure of inconvenient individuals from both physical reality and collective memory, creating society where opposition to his rule became literally unthinkable, because evidence of such opposition had been removed from existence itself. The factory operations that relied upon slave labor from these transformed victims provided both economic foundation for his continued activities and demonstration of how thoroughly he had abandoned any pretense of conventional morality, pursuit of goals that he considered more important than individual, human dignity. The rule he established over Dressrosa combined genuine improvements in certain areas with systematic brutalization of anyone who might potentially threaten his authority. His understanding that effective tyranny required providing enough benefits to collaborators to maintain their support, while ensuring that the cost of resistance remained prohibitively high for all but the most desperately committed opponents. The gladiatorial games that he sponsored provided entertainment for citizens while serving as method for eliminating potential threats and recruiting talented individuals whose skills could be redirected towards serving his organization's needs. The arrival of Trafalgar Law and the Straw Hat Pirates represented the kind of unpredictable convergence of circumstances that even the most sophisticated planning could not anticipate, though Doflamingo's response to these challenges revealed both his tactical flexibility and the psychological blind spots that years of unchallenged authority had created in his understanding of how power relationships could shift when confronted by opponents who operated according to different principles than those he had learned to expect from enemies. The personal history he shared with Law added emotional dimensions to their conflict that complicated purely strategic considerations, while the broader implications of being challenged so directly threatened foundations upon which his entire post-celestial dragon identity had been constructed. The battle that would ultimately determine his fate tested not just his combat abilities but his fundamental worldview. Luffy's refusal to accept that strength meant the right to dominate others, serving as direct challenge to principles that had guided his entire approach to rebuilding power from the ashes of his childhood's destruction. The techniques he deployed during their extended confrontation represented culmination of decades spent developing applications for his string fruit that pushed its capabilities into realms that bordered on reality, manipulation, his awakened powers, allowing him to transform entire landscapes into extensions of his will, made manifest in physical form. The defeat that followed was comprehensive and public, destroying not just his immediate control over Dressrosa, but the carefully constructed mythology that had supported his claim to inevitable victory over anyone who dared to challenge his authority. The revelation of his true nature and the systematic crimes he had committed against the kingdom's population, eliminating any possibility that he might maintain influence through the kind of narrative manipulation that had previously allowed him to transform defeats into apparent victories. The imprisonment that followed represented fall from heights of power to depths of helplessness that mirrored in some ways the trajectory his family had experienced during his childhood, though his adult perspective allowed him to process such reversal with greater understanding of the forces that had brought it about. The knowledge he possessed about the world government's deepest secrets, accumulated through years of operating in spaces where official policy intersected with criminal activity, remained his most valuable asset, even within the confines of Impel Down. His understanding of how the system actually functioned, providing leverage that could potentially be converted into freedom or influence under the right circumstances. The laughter he had displayed when first confronted with information about Imu's existence suggested recognition of ironies and connections that remained hidden from most observers. His unique background, providing perspective on current events that few other prisoners could match in terms of historical context or political sophistication. The potential for escape or release remained real, given his combination of personal capabilities, external connections, and valuable information, though the form that such liberation might take and the purposes to which his freedom might be directed remained questions whose answers would depend on circumstances that had not yet crystallized into definitive patterns. The possibility of alliance with Cross Guild represented logical development, given their shared status as former warlords whose government-sanctioned activities had provided them with resources and connections that conventional pirates could not match, while his knowledge of celestial dragon vulnerabilities could prove invaluable in conflicts that seemed increasingly likely to involve direct challenges to the world government's authority. The dreams that sustained him through incarceration remained characteristically grandiose and morally ambiguous. His vision of a world where strength determined hierarchy and weakness was eliminated through natural selection, representing philosophical framework that had emerged from his particular combination of privilege, trauma, and practical experience with how power actually functioned in practice rather than theory. The heavenly demon who had once ruled a kingdom through fear and manipulation continued to believe that his approach to leadership represented honest acknowledgement of human nature's fundamental realities. His rejection of conventional morality, stemming not from sadistic enjoyment of cruelty, but from conviction that such principles were luxuries that could not be afforded by those who sought to achieve meaningful change in a world that rewarded strength and punished weakness with impartial consistency. Standing now in his cell within the underwater fortress that had contained some of history's most dangerous criminals, Don Quixote do Flamingo represented the complex interplay between inherited privilege and earned power, his pink feathers catching what little light penetrated his confinement. As his mind continued calculating possibilities for reclaiming influence that had been temporarily lost, but never truly abandoned, the fallen god preparing for whatever role he would play in conflicts that would determine whether the systems he had learned to manipulate would survive the challenges that were gathering like storm clouds on every horizon. In the annals of pirate history, where dreams and ambition collide with the harsh realities of an unforgiving world, few stories carry the weight of tragedy that surrounds the name of Gecko Moria, a man whose journey from promising captain to broken shadow of his former self serves as sobering reminder that even the strongest spirits can be shattered when confronted with losses too profound for the human heart to fully process or accept. His tale begins not in the darkness that would later define him, but in the bright optimism of youth, when the future seemed limitless, and every horizon promised adventures that would elevate his name among the legends whose exploits had inspired an entire generation to seek their fortunes upon the quote, endless seas. The island of his birth lay somewhere in the treacherous waters of the Grand Line, where the very air seemed charged with possibility and danger in equal measure, though the specific location has been lost to the passage of time and the deliberate obscurity that Moria himself imposed upon his past when memories became too painful to bear examination in daylight hours. What remains clear from the scattered accounts of those who knew him during his formative years is that young Gecko possessed the kind of natural charisma and innovative thinking that marked him as someone destined for significance. His ability to inspire loyalty in others and devise creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems, suggesting potential that might have rivaled any of the era's emerging legends. His early crew was composed of individuals who had chosen to follow him, not out of fear or desperation, but from genuine belief that he possessed the vision and capability necessary to achieve the kinds of dreams that conventional wisdom dismissed as impossible fantasies born from ignorance of how the world actually functioned. The bonds that developed between captain and subordinates went beyond mere professional association to encompass the kind of familial affection that transformed their ship into something approaching a floating community, where each member's individual aspirations were supported by collective effort and mutual sacrifice for shared objectives that seemed achievable through coordinated application of their complementary skills. The shadow fruit that would later define his approach to combat and philosophy came into his possession during one of these early adventures, though the circumstances surrounding its acquisition were overshadowed by the joy of discovery and the endless possibilities that such power seemed to offer to someone whose imagination had always operated on scales that exceeded conventional limitations. The ability to manipulate shadows, both his own and those of others, opened tactical possibilities that no previous Devil Fruit user had explored. His growing mastery of these capabilities, providing foundation for combat techniques that were as innovative as they were effective against opponents who had never encountered anything similar. The development of his shadow-based abilities required not just technical understanding of the fruit's mechanical functions, but philosophical integration of what it meant to command aspects of existence that most people never consciously considered. His growing expertise, revealing layers of reality that remained hidden from those whose perception was limited to immediately visible phenomena. The shadows that responded to his will carried within them echoes of the people and objects that had cast them, fragments of identity and purpose that could be extracted and redistributed according to his desires, though the full implications of such power would not become clear until much later, when desperation forced him to explore applications that his younger self would have considered morally unacceptable. The reputation he built during these early years was founded upon fair dealing and honorable conduct that set him apart from many contemporary pirates whose methods relied heavily on intimidation and brutality to achieve objectives that might have been accomplished through more creative approaches, requiring patience and strategic thinking. His willingness to negotiate with opponents when possible, and his refusal to harm non-combatants, even when doing so might have provided tactical advantages, earned him respect from both allies and enemies, though this adherence to principles would later be seen as naivety by those who survived the events that transformed him from idealistic dreamer into pragmatic survivor. The decision to challenge Kaido represented the culmination of years spent building strength and reputation sufficient to justify attempting what many considered suicide. Though Moriya's confidence in his crew's abilities and his own strategic planning suggested that victory was at least theoretically possible for someone who approached the confrontation with proper preparation and innovative tactics that could compensate for any disadvantage in raw, physical power. The intelligence they had gathered about the future Emperor's capabilities indicated formidable opponent, but not necessarily insurmountable one, particularly if their assault could exploit weaknesses in his operation that more conventional approaches might have missed entirely. The journey to Wano country was undertaken with high spirits and careful planning that accounted for every variable their research had identified as potentially significant, each crew member understanding their role in strategies that had been rehearsed until they became second nature. Their confidence built upon months of preparation and the kind of mutual trust that could only develop through shared experience of overcoming challenges that had initially seemed beyond their capabilities. The ship that carried them toward what they expected to be their greatest triumph was filled with laughter and anticipation, the bonds between captain and crew stronger than they had ever been, as they approached the moment when all their dreams would either be fulfilled or forever shattered. The battle that followed was unlike anything they had prepared for or imagined possible. Kaido's strength operating on scales that made their careful planning irrelevant and their innovative techniques meaningless in the face of power that seemed to transcend normal limitations through sheer overwhelming force applied, without restraint or mercy. The crew members who had followed Moriya out of love and loyalty found themselves confronted with enemy whose abilities made their years of training and coordination seem like children's games, their attacks having no meaningful impact, while each of Kaido's responses threatened to eliminate multiple opponents through casual applications of strength that defied conventional understanding. One by one, the people who had become his family through shared adventure and mutual sacrifice fell before force that acknowledged no distinction between combatant and non-combatant, friend and foe, their individual skills and collective courage, meaning nothing against someone whose power had evolved beyond the point where such considerations could influence outcomes, determined purely by the mathematical relationship between applied force and structural integrity. Moria's desperate attempts to protect his subordinates through increasingly reckless applications of his devil fruit abilities only delayed the inevitable while forcing him to witness in excruciating detail the destruction of everything that had given his life meaning and purpose. The psychological trauma that accompanied the physical devastation of his crew created wounds that would never fully heal. The survivor's guilt combining with profound grief to produce emotional damage that fundamentally altered his understanding of what strength meant and how it should be pursued by anyone who hoped to avoid similar losses. The man who had once believed that bonds between people represented the ultimate source of power found himself confronting evidence that such connections were actually liabilities that could be exploited by enemies whose ruthlessness exceeded their victims' capacity to protect what they valued most. The escape from Wano was accomplished through means that Moria would never discuss in detail, though the scattered accounts of those who witnessed his departure described someone whose spirit had been broken in ways that went far beyond simple defeat in battle to encompass fundamental destruction of beliefs and values that had previously guided every significant decision he had made. The captain who had arrived with confidence and dreams departed as hollow shell of his former self, his survival seemingly more accidental than intentional, the result of circumstances beyond his control, rather than any deliberate effort to preserve his own existence for future purposes. The years that followed were characterized by isolation and brooding, contemplation of lessons learned through loss too devastating to be processed through normal psychological mechanisms. His understanding of power relationships, having been revolutionized in ways that made his previous optimism seem like dangerous delusion, born from inexperience with how the world actually functioned, when idealism encountered forces that recognized no constraints beyond their own immediate desires. The shadows that had once been tools for creative problem-solving became refuges from reality that had proven too harsh for direct confrontation, his growing expertise with their manipulation serving both practical purposes and psychological needs that conventional human interaction could no longer satisfy. The philosophy that emerged from this period of reconstruction emphasized the folly of relying upon individual growth when others' strength could be appropriated and redirected toward achieving objectives that personal development could never accomplish within the limitations imposed by human lifespan and physical capability. His understanding that the dead could not experience further loss led to extensive experimentation with techniques that would allow him to build armies from the fallen rather than risk additional connections with living beings whose mortality represented vulnerabilities that his enemies could exploit with devastating effectiveness. The development of his zombie creation abilities required both technical mastery of shadow manipulation and psychological acceptance of moral compromises that his younger self would have found abhorrent, though the practical advantages of commanding subordinates who felt no fear, required no rest, and could be replaced indefinitely justified whatever ethical concerns might have troubled someone whose perspective had not been shaped by witnessing the complete destruction of everything he had once held sacred. The corpses that became his soldiers were treated with respect for what they had once been while being utilized for purposes that served his current needs. His approach, balancing pragmatic necessity with residual humanity that refused to be completely eliminated by trauma. The acquisition of Thriller Bark represented both practical achievement and symbolic statement about his intentions regarding future operations. The massive ship providing platform for activities that required isolation from government oversight, while its Gothic architecture reflected psychological state of someone whose worldview had been permanently darkened by experiences that had taught him to expect betrayal and loss from any situation that involved genuine emotional investment. The island-sized vessel became both fortress and laboratory, where he could pursue research into death and resurrection without interference from those who might object to his methods on moral grounds that seemed irrelevant to someone whose understanding of ethics had been revised through direct confrontation with absolute evil. The recruitment of subordinates during this period followed patterns that differed significantly from his earlier approach to crew building. His selection criteria, emphasizing competence and reliability rather than personal compatibility or shared values, though he maintained sufficient concern for their welfare to ensure that their loyalty was secured through genuine care for their individual needs rather than fear of punishment for inadequate performance. The relationship he developed with Perona demonstrated that his capacity for affection had not been entirely destroyed by previous trauma, though the protective instincts that her presence awakened created new vulnerabilities that his enemies might potentially exploit if they understood the significance of these connections. The years spent perfecting his zombie army provided both distraction from persistent grief and tangible progress toward building strength sufficient to challenge opponents whose power had previously seemed insurmountable, though the isolation required for such work gradually separated him from the kinds of human interaction that might have facilitated healthier processing of psychological wounds that continued to influence every decision he made. The creatures he animated through shadow manipulation possessed combat capabilities that exceeded those of most living pirates, while their numbers could be expanded indefinitely through acquisition of additional corpses, creating military force whose potential seemed limited only by his ability to locate suitable raw materials. The encounter with the Straw Hat Pirates represented the first serious challenge to his operations since establishing himself on Thriller Bark, though his initial assessment of their capabilities suggested that they posed manageable threat that could be eliminated through application of standard tactics that had proven effective against previous intruders who had attempted to interfere with his research. The battles that followed revealed both the effectiveness of techniques he had spent years developing and limitations that he had not previously recognized. Luffy's refusal to accept defeat despite overwhelming disadvantages serving as uncomfortable reminder of his own younger self's approach to seemingly impossible challenges. The defeat that ultimately resulted from their confrontation was less devastating than what he had experienced at Kaido's hands, but perhaps more philosophically significant. The demonstration that his current methods were insufficient to guarantee victory against opponents whose strength derived from sources he had chosen to abandon, providing evidence that his approach to rebuilding might have been fundamentally flawed from its inception. The loss of his zombie army represented setback rather than catastrophe, though the implications for his worldview were more profound than the immediate tactical consequences might have suggested to outside observers. The participation in the Marineford War offered opportunity to test his capabilities against high-level opponents while observing how power relationships functioned in conflicts that involved multiple factions with competing objectives. His survival of the battle, providing validation that his methods retained effectiveness, even when deployed against enemies whose abilities operated on scales comparable to those that had originally traumatized him. The experience revealed both strengths and weaknesses in his current approach, while suggesting possibilities for future development that might address limitations that had become apparent through direct combat experience. The aftermath of the war and subsequent changes in global power structures created new opportunities and threats that required careful evaluation of his position and objectives. The dissolution of the warlord system, eliminating legal protection he had enjoyed, while potentially opening paths toward alliances with former colleagues whose circumstances had been similarly affected by governmental policy changes. The decision of how to respond to these altered conditions would require balancing desire for revenge against practical considerations regarding what goals were achievable through available means and what prices he was willing to pay for. Various forms of satisfaction. The current period represents inflection point where lessons learned through decades of trauma and adaptation must be integrated with new realities that offer possibilities for redemption or renewed tragedy, depending on choices made. Regarding fundamental questions about the nature of strength and the proper relationship between individual ambition and collective welfare, the shadows that respond to his will continue to whisper of power that could be claimed through methods that previous experience has validated, while memories of what had once inspired him to seek greatness suggest alternative approaches that might prove more sustainable in the long term, despite their apparent limitations when measured against purely tactical considerations. Standing now at the crossroads between past and future, Gecko Moria embodies the complex interplay between hope and despair that characterizes those who have survived losses so profound that they challenge fundamental assumptions about what makes life worth living, his pale skin catching moonlight as his mind continues, processing possibilities for reclaiming purpose that had been lost when everything he valued was taken from him by forces whose power seemed to transcend any conceivable response that individual will could muster against such overwhelming opposition. In the shadowed corners of history, where the most profound acts of love and sacrifice unfold beyond the notice of those who would celebrate such nobility, the story of Bartholomew Kuma stands as testament to the depths of devotion that can exist within hearts that have known both the cruelest oppression and the most transcendent hope. His tale begins in an era when the very mention of the buccaneer race was enough to inspire terror in those who served the world government's interests. These proud people, whose heritage traced back to times when giants walked among men, representing everything that the established order sought to eliminate from a world that demanded conformity to systems built upon the systematic dehumanization of anyone whose existence challenged carefully, maintained hierarchies of power and privilege. The island where young Bartholomew first drew breath was one of countless territories scattered across the oceans where the buccaneers had established communities that thrived through combination of their natural strength and deep, spiritual connections to traditions that predated the world. Governments rise to dominance, their society organized around principles that valued individual worth over inherited status while maintaining collective responsibility for ensuring that no member of their community faced hardship alone. The child who would one day be known as the tyrant grew up surrounded by stories of ancient heroes whose deeds had shaped the world's history, though the versions he heard emphasized not conquest or domination, but protection of the innocent and resistance against forces that sought to reduce human dignity to mere commodity in transactions that benefited only those who possessed sufficient power to enforce their will upon others. The physical characteristics that marked him as a buccaneer became apparent during his early years, his unusual size and strength developing alongside moral framework that had been shaped by elders who understood that great power carried with it obligations that could not be shirked without compromising the very qualities that made such strength worth possessing. The bear-like features that would later inspire his epithet were sources of pride rather than shame in a community that celebrated diversity, while recognizing that appearances often influenced how others perceived and responded to individuals whose nature they did not immediately understand. His family ensuring that he learned to carry himself with dignity that commanded respect rather than inspiring fear in those whose ignorance might otherwise lead them to make dangerous assumptions. The arrival of the slavers who would destroy his childhood paradise came with the systematic brutality that characterized all world government operations designed to eliminate populations whose continued existence represented ideological challenges to systems that required absolute submission from those they claimed to govern. The buccaneers' strength and spiritual traditions made them particularly dangerous in the eyes of authorities who understood that their example could inspire others to question why some people deserved freedom, while others were condemned to servitude based on nothing more than circumstances of birth or political convenience that served the interests of those who had never earned their positions through merit or moral authority. The capture that separated young Bartholomew from his family was accomplished through methods that demonstrated both the world government's tactical sophistication and their complete disregard for any ethical considerations that might have restrained organizations whose power derived from more legitimate sources. The systematic separation of parents from children designed not just to prevent organized resistance, but to break psychological bonds that might sustain hope during the years of brutalization that would follow. The ships that carried him away from everything familiar were floating hells where human cargo was processed according to economic calculations that assigned monetary value to lives, while treating suffering as acceptable overhead in transactions that generated profits for those whose participation remained safely distant from the actual implementation of policies they had designed. The island where he was eventually sold bore the scars of centuries spent serving as marketplace for human misery, its economy built entirely around the systematic brutalization of beings whose only crime had been existing in ways that inconvenienced people with sufficient influence to have them redesignated as property rather than persons deserving basic consideration. The plantation where Bartholomew spent his formative years was operated according to principles that maximized productivity while minimizing costs, the owners viewing their workforce as equipment that required maintenance only to the extent necessary for preserving their investment in flesh that could be replaced when wear and abuse rendered individual units insufficiently profitable. The work that consumed his days was designed not just to generate wealth for his captors, but to break spirits that might otherwise sustain resistance against systems that depended upon hopelessness for their continued operation. Each task assigned, not because it served necessary functions, but because its performance under constant threat of violent punishment would gradually erode whatever sense of personal worth might survive the initial trauma of enslavement. The food provided was calculated to maintain minimal functionality while preventing the kind of physical strength that might enable escape attempts, though Bartholomew's buccaneer heritage allowed him to endure conditions that would have killed ordinary humans while retaining enough vitality to protect those weaker than himself when circumstances permitted such intervention. The friendships he formed with fellow slaves provided glimpses of the humanity that their captors sought to eliminate through systematic dehumanization. Relationships built upon shared suffering, but sustained by recognition that individual worth transcended whatever circumstances might be imposed by those whose power derived from their willingness to embrace moral bankruptcy as acceptable cost for material gain. The stories shared during brief moments when supervision relaxed revealed rich inner lives that continued to flourish, despite external conditions designed to reduce complex human beings to simple economic units whose value could be calculated according to formulas that ignored everything that actually made existence meaningful. The meeting with Ginny occurred during one of the rare celebrations that their captors permitted as means of preventing the kind of despair that might lead to suicide rates that would impact their investment portfolio, her laughter cutting through atmosphere of oppression, like sunlight penetrating storm clouds that had seemed too dense to allow any illumination of landscape below. The connection that developed between them transcended the immediate circumstances of their meeting to encompass recognition of kindred spirits whose fundamental natures had remained intact despite years spent in environments specifically designed to eliminate hope through constant demonstration. That resistance was futile, and acceptance was the only rational response to overwhelming force. The God Valley incident that would reshape the world's power structures began as a tournament designed to entertain celestial dragons whose appetite for spectacular violence could no longer be satisfied by ordinary forms of brutality that had become routine through repetition. The native population of the island designated as prey in hunting game that would demonstrate the superiority of those whose inherited positions had never been earned through personal achievement or moral development. The slaves who were brought to serve as additional targets possessed skills and knowledge that made them potentially dangerous if circumstances ever provided opportunities to direct their capabilities toward purposes that served their own interests rather than those of their tormentors. The battle that erupted when pirates arrived to challenge the world nobles' authority created chaos that temporarily disrupted normal power relationships, the confusion providing opportunities for actions that would have been impossible under ordinary circumstances where surveillance and control mechanisms operated with their usual efficiency. Bartholomew's participation in these events remained largely hidden from historical records that focused on more prominent figures whose roles were easier to document and whose motivations aligned with narratives that served various political purposes, though the relationships he formed during this period would influence every subsequent decision he made throughout his remarkable life. The rescue of Ginny during the God Valley chaos required courage and tactical thinking that demonstrated capabilities his captors had never suspected he possessed. Their systematic efforts to break his spirit, having failed to eliminate qualities that remained dormant rather than destroyed during years spent enduring conditions that would have crushed lesser individuals. The escape they accomplished together was aided by circumstances beyond their control, but succeeded primarily through careful planning and execution that took advantage of opportunities created by larger conflicts between forces whose attention was focused on objectives that seemed more immediately significant than preventing the liberation of individuals they had never considered truly important. The freedom that followed their escape from God Valley was complicated by practical realities that made simple survival challenging for individuals whose legal status remained unclear and whose unique characteristics made them conspicuous in societies where conformity was often necessary for avoiding unwanted attention from authorities. The years they spent together establishing new identities and learning to live as free people were marked by gradual healing from trauma that had shaped their understanding of what human relationships could become when built upon mutual respect rather than power, imbalances enforced through threats of violence. The courtship that developed between them was conducted against backdrop of constant awareness that their happiness existed in defiance of systems that would destroy it if given opportunity, their love serving as daily affirmation that beauty could emerge from even the most unpromising circumstances when two people committed themselves to creating something worthwhile from whatever materials their experiences had provided. The wedding ceremony they eventually shared was small and private, witnessed only by those few individuals who had earned their complete trust though the vows they exchanged carried weight that transcended any official recognition that governments or religious institutions might have provided. The discovery of Ginny's pregnancy brought joy tempered by realistic understanding of what dangers their child would face in a world where buccaneer heritage remained grounds for persecution by those whose power depended upon maintaining hierarchies that placed some lives above others in arbitrary arrangements that served no purpose beyond preserving existing advantages for those who had never earned them. The preparations they made for their daughter's arrival included careful consideration of how to provide security without sacrificing the freedom they had fought so hard to achieve. Their planning, reflecting hard-won wisdom about balancing hope with pragmatism in circumstances where idealism alone was insufficient protection against forces that recognized no constraints beyond their own immediate interests. Jewelry Bonnie's birth marked the beginning of a period characterized by domestic happiness that seemed almost miraculous to individuals whose earlier experiences had provided little evidence that such contentment was possible for people whose backgrounds included systematic brutalization by systems that claimed moral authority while practicing the most profound forms of cruelty. The child who would one day become a powerful pirate captain in her own right grew up surrounded by love that had been refined through suffering into something approaching pure devotion. Her parents' commitment to her welfare, providing foundation for development of character traits that would serve her well during challenges they could not foresee but instinctively prepared her to face. The contact with Monkey D. Dragon during this period introduced revolutionary possibilities that aligned with values Bartholomew had developed through direct experience with oppression, though his initial involvement with the organization that would eventually become known as the Revolutionary Army was motivated more by desire to prevent others from enduring what he had suffered than by abstract political theories about how societies should be restructured. The friendship that developed with Dragon was based upon mutual recognition of individuals whose understanding of injustice had been shaped by personal experience rather than academic study. Their collaboration, creating possibilities for meaningful change that neither could have achieved independently. Ivankov's arrival in their lives brought medical expertise and hormonal therapies that would prove crucial during later crises, though the friendships that developed were founded upon shared commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves, rather than simple, professional, convenience, or strategic alliance between individuals whose objectives happened to align temporarily. The bonds forged during this period would endure through decades of separation and hardship, providing emotional anchor that sustained them through trials that might otherwise have broken spirits that had already endured more trauma than most people could survive while retaining their essential humanity. The onset of Ginny's mysterious illness marked beginning of period characterized by desperate search for treatments that might preserve life that had become more precious than anything else either parent could imagine losing. Their investigation revealing connections between her condition and experiences during God Valley that suggested their past continued to influence present circumstances in ways they had not previously understood. The progression of symptoms that gradually transformed her appearance while threatening her survival created emotional agony that was complicated by practical considerations regarding how to obtain medical care without revealing identities that would make them targets for those who had never forgotten their escape from slavery. The decision to accept warlord status represented compromise that violated principles Bartholomew had maintained throughout his adult life, though the access to world government resources that such position would provide seemed to offer their only hope for finding treatment that might save Ginny's life before her condition progressed beyond point where intervention could be effective. The negotiations that led to his official recognition as government-sanctioned pirate required careful balance between appearing sufficiently cooperative to gain their trust while maintaining enough independence to pursue objectives that served his family's needs rather than their political agenda. The early years of his warlord tenure were characterized by meticulous fulfillment of official obligations, while secretly directing resources toward research that might provide solutions to problems that government scientists had shown no interest in investigating. His unique position, allowing access to information and equipment that would have been impossible to obtain through other channels. The modification procedures that Dr. Vegapunk performed were presented as enhancements designed to improve his effectiveness in serving world government interests, though the true purpose involved preserving his memories and personality while gradually replacing organic systems with mechanical alternatives that would not be vulnerable to the same types of biological deterioration that threatened Ginny. The relationship with Vegapunk was complicated by mutual understanding that their official collaboration served purposes neither could publicly acknowledge. The scientist's genuine interest in preserving human consciousness through technological means, aligning with Bartholomew's desperate need to find ways of protecting his family that transcended normal limitations imposed by mortality and political circumstance. The experiments that followed required gradual sacrifice of physical humanity in exchange for capabilities that might prove necessary for ensuring Bonnie's survival in a world where powerful enemies would eventually discover her existence and attempt to use her as weapon against him. The progression of cybernetic modifications created increasing distance between his consciousness and the emotional responses that had previously guided his decision-making processes. Though core values and commitments remained intact beneath layers of technological interface that filtered immediate reactions through calculating systems designed to optimize outcomes rather than provide emotional satisfaction. The man who had once acted purely from instinct and moral conviction learned to process ethical questions through analytical frameworks that could account for long-term consequences while maintaining commitment to principles that no amount of mechanical alteration could eliminate entirely. The secret missions he undertook for the Revolutionary Army during this period required careful coordination with Dragon, while maintaining appearance of complete loyalty to world government interests. His unique position allowing him to gather intelligence and provide assistance that proved crucial for operations that would have been impossible without inside information about official plans and capabilities. The resources he diverted toward revolutionary objectives represented significant personal risk, though the cause they served aligned so completely with his fundamental values that such danger seemed acceptable price for opportunities to prevent others from experiencing the kinds of trauma that had shaped his own development. The protection of the Thousand Sunny during the Straw Hat Pirates' 2-year separation represented assignment that resonated with aspects of his personality that mechanical modifications had not eliminated. His recognition of Luffy's potential importance for future conflicts, justifying commitment of resources that exceeded what strategic calculation alone would have suggested. The ship he guarded carried within its wooden hull dreams and aspirations that reminded him of his own family's hopes, the similarity providing motivation that transcended official orders or revolutionary objectives to encompass personal investment in outcomes that served larger purposes than immediate tactical considerations. The encounter with Zoro at Thriller Bark revealed depths of loyalty and sacrifice that echoed his own willingness to endure any hardship for those he loved, the swordsman's acceptance of Luffy's pain serving as demonstration of bonds that no external force could break or diminish, through application of pressure designed to separate individuals from sources of meaning that sustained them through impossible circumstances. The respect he felt for such commitment influenced his subsequent interactions with the Straw Hat crew, while reinforcing his understanding that some forms of strength derived from connections between people rather than individual capabilities alone. The final sacrifice that preserved Bonnie's life came at cost of consciousness that had been gradually diminishing through years of mechanical modification. Though the choice was made with complete understanding of what would be lost and clear recognition that such price was acceptable for ensuring his daughter's survival in a world where she would face dangers he could no longer protect her from through direct intervention. The procedures that Dr. Vegapunk performed preserved his memories and personality within systems that could function independently while transferring his human essence into formats that would remain accessible to those who possessed knowledge and equipment necessary for potential restoration. The worship of Nika that had sustained him through decades of hardship was rooted in understanding that some forms of hope transcended rational analysis to encompass faith that liberation was possible, even when circumstances seemed designed to crush such beliefs through constant demonstration that resistance was futile and acceptance was the only viable response to overwhelming force. The prayers he offered to the sun god carried weight of personal experience, with both the darkness that could consume individual lives and the light that could emerge when people chose to believe that change was possible despite evidence suggesting otherwise. The connection he recognized between Luffy and the legendary figure whose return had been prophesied by those who maintained oral traditions that predated written records created sense of completion that mechanical modifications could not eliminate. His understanding that his own sacrifices had contributed to circumstances that made such awakening possible, providing satisfaction that transcended personal considerations to encompass participation in historical processes whose significance extended far beyond individual lives or immediate consequences. Standing now in whatever form consciousness had taken after surrendering humanity for purposes that served love deeper than self-preservation, Bartholomew Kuma represents ultimate expression of devotion that accepts any cost for protection of those whose welfare provides meaning that transcends all other considerations. His massive frame containing within its mechanical system's heart that continues beating with rhythm of hopes and dreams that no amount of technological alteration could eliminate from spirit that had been refined through suffering into something approaching perfect love made manifest in selfless action. In the heart of the calm belt where serpentine sea kings glide through waters that have witnessed countless tales of valor and despair, there exists an island shrouded in mystery and legend, home to a tribe of warriors, whose very existence challenges the fundamental assumptions that most of the world holds about strength, beauty, and the complex relationships between power and vulnerability. Amazon Lily rises from these treacherous seas like a jewel carved from living stone, its towering peaks crowned with structures that blend seamlessly with the natural landscape, while housing secrets that have been carefully guarded for generations by women whose understanding of combat has been refined through centuries of isolation from the corrupting influences that characterize much of human civilization. The child who would one day rule this paradise as its empress entered the world during a time of relative peace. Though even in tranquility, the Kuja warriors maintained constant vigilance against threats that might emerge from beyond their protected waters. Boa Hancock's early years were spent in an environment where strength was celebrated and nurtured rather than feared or suppressed. Her natural beauty emerging alongside combat abilities that marked her as exceptional, even among people whose entire culture was built around the cultivation of both physical prowess and spiritual harmony that allowed individual excellence to flourish without creating divisions between those who excelled and those who supported them through different forms of contribution. The island itself served as perfect training ground for developing warriors, whose capabilities would be tested not just against human opponents, but against the massive sea creatures that inhabited surrounding waters, their daily lives requiring constant demonstration of skills that most pirates would consider extraordinary, while they regarded such abilities as simple necessities for survival in a world that showed no mercy to those who could not defend themselves against forces that recognized no moral constraints in their pursuit of whatever objectives drove their behavior. The education she received encompassed not just martial techniques, but philosophical frameworks that emphasized protection of the innocent and preservation of cultural traditions that had sustained their people through centuries of external pressure from those who viewed their independence as threat to systems that required universal submission to maintain stability. The stories told by her elders carried within them wisdom accumulated through generations of experience with how power could be wielded responsibly while maintaining connections to spiritual principles that prevented strength from becoming mere tool for domination of those less fortunate or capable. Her sisters, Sandersonia and Marigold, shared in this upbringing while developing their own unique approaches to the challenges that their environment presented, the bonds between them strengthening through shared training and mutual support that created foundation of trust and affection that would prove crucial during trials they could not yet imagine. The games they played and competitions they engaged in were designed not just to improve individual performance, but to reinforce cooperative instincts that would allow them to function as coordinated unit when circumstances required collective response to threats that exceeded what any single warrior could handle alone. The devil fruit that would later define her combat abilities remained unknown during these early years, though signs of unusual potential were evident in ways that suggested destiny was already beginning to assert influence over development that might otherwise have followed more conventional patterns established by previous generations of Kuya warriors. The love fruit would eventually grant her powers that seemed almost cruelly ironic given the circumstances under which she would first experience the darker aspects of what human affection could become when corrupted by systems that reduced other people to objects whose only value lay in whatever pleasure or utility they could provide to those with sufficient power to claim ownership over their bodies and souls. The kidnapping that would shatter her childhood paradise came without warning during what should have been routine exploration beyond the island's immediate shores, their small boat overwhelmed by forces that possessed both superior numbers and intimate knowledge of how to capture and transport human cargo without alerting potential rescuers to what was happening until intervention became impossible. The slavers who took them operated with professional efficiency that spoke to years of experience in such enterprises, their methods designed to minimize damage to merchandise while ensuring compliance through carefully calibrated applications of fear and pain. The auction house where they were eventually displayed represented everything that was most corrupt about a world that claimed to operate according to principles of justice and order, while permitting systematic brutalization of innocent people for the entertainment and convenience of those whose inherited privileges had never been earned through personal achievement or moral development. The building itself was designed to present human suffering as spectacle worthy of celebration, its architecture emphasizing the power differential between buyers and merchandise, while creating atmosphere that encouraged bidders to view their potential purchases as objects rather than beings capable of experiencing fear and despair. The celestial dragons, who ultimately claimed ownership over the three sisters, embodied the absolute corruption that unlimited power could create in individuals whose every whim had been treated as sacred commands since birth, their casual cruelty emerging not from calculated malice, but from fundamental inability to recognize that other people possessed inner lives that deserved consideration equal to their own immediate desires. The branded mark that was burned into their backs served both practical purpose of identifying property and psychological function of reminding them constantly that their previous identities had been erased through legal processes that transformed them from human beings with rights and dignity into commodities whose value was determined entirely by their utility to owners. The years that followed represented descent into hell that was carefully orchestrated to break spirits that might otherwise sustain resistance against treatment designed to eliminate every trace of personality that was not directly useful for providing entertainment or service to masters whose appetites seemed to grow more elaborate and demanding with each demonstration of complete power over others' lives. The physical abuse they endured was accompanied by systematic psychological warfare intended to convince them that their current circumstances represented natural order that reflected their inherent unworthiness for better treatment, though the bonds between sisters provided anchor to reality that prevented complete surrender to despair that might have offered easier path through trauma they were forced to experience. The escape that eventually freed them from their captors came through combination of opportunity and desperate courage that transformed years of suffering into motivation for achieving what had seemed impossible during darkest moments when hope itself became luxury they could not afford to maintain without risking complete psychological collapse. The details of their liberation remained closely guarded secret that none of them ever discussed in detail, though the scars they carried, both visible and hidden, testified to costs that had been paid for freedom, whose value could never be adequately measured by those who had never experienced its absence. The return to Amazon Lily represented homecoming complicated by changes that captivity had wrought in their understanding of themselves and the world beyond their protected island, their experiences having provided knowledge of human cruelty that their previous education had not prepared them to process, while their survival had demonstrated strength that even they had not realized they possessed under circumstances that might have destroyed individuals whose spirits had not been forged through shared adversity that created bonds deeper than conventional family relationships. The ascension to the position of Empress occurred through combination of demonstrated capability and recognition by her people that leadership required not just traditional qualifications but understanding of external threats that could only come through direct experience with forces that viewed their independence as challenge to systems that demanded universal submission to maintain stability. The authority she assumed carried with it responsibilities that extended far beyond simple governance of domestic affairs to encompass protection of cultural traditions and physical security that required constant vigilance against enemies whose patience and resources exceeded anything their ancestors had faced. The devil fruit powers that manifested during this period seemed almost designed to reflect the complex relationship between love and power that her experiences had taught her to navigate with extreme caution. The Mero Mero no Mi, granting abilities that could transform attraction into weapon while serving as daily reminder of how feelings that should have been sources of joy had been corrupted by those who viewed others' emotions as tools for manipulation and control. The stone petrification that resulted from her attacks carried symbolic weight that spoke to her understanding of how beauty could become curse when it attracted attention from those whose concept of love was indistinguishable from ownership. The mastery of Conqueror's haki that developed alongside her fruit abilities reflected natural leadership qualities that had been refined through trials that would have broken lesser individuals, her ability to impose her will upon others, emerging not from desire for domination, but from recognition that some circumstances required decisive action that could not be achieved through negotiation or compromise with forces that understood only strength and viewed mercy as weakness to be exploited. The unconsciousness that followed her releases of spiritual pressure provided evidence of power that operated on scales comparable to the world's most formidable individuals, while serving purposes that aligned with protection rather than conquest. The recruitment as one of the 7 warlords of the sea represented strategic necessity rather than personal ambition, her acceptance of government sanction, providing legal framework that offered some protection for her people, while positioning her to gather intelligence about threats that might emerge from official channels. The authority that came with such recognition allowed her to operate beyond the island's immediate vicinity while maintaining appearance of cooperation with systems she despised. Her compliance with official requirements representing calculated performance designed to preserve independence that could not be maintained through open defiance of superior forces. The encounters with other warlords during mandatory meetings revealed complex dynamics between individuals whose backgrounds and motivations differed dramatically, while their shared status created temporary alliances based on mutual recognition of what they had gained and lost through accepting government sanction. The relationships she formed during this period were characterized by cautious respect rather than genuine friendship, though her interactions with figures like Jinbei and Kuma suggested possibilities for cooperation that transcended immediate political considerations to encompass shared values regarding protection of innocent people who lacked power to defend themselves. The arrival of Monkey D. Luffy on her island represented challenge that operated according to rules she had never encountered. His complete immunity to her beauty-based attacks, forcing recognition that her understanding of how attraction functioned as weapon was incomplete when confronted by individual whose psychological makeup rendered her primary combat advantage meaningless. The initial hostility that characterized their interactions gradually transformed into something resembling fascination as she observed responses that defied every pattern she had learned to expect from men whose behavior had previously been entirely predictable once her powers were deployed. The incident that would reshape her entire worldview occurred when Luffy's intervention prevented public revelation of the slave mark that remained branded into her skin. His instinctive understanding that some secrets were too painful to be exposed, even when concealment created tactical disadvantages, demonstrating empathy that she had not believed could exist in anyone whose strength exceeded her own ability to control or manipulate. The protection he offered was given freely without expectation of reward or acknowledgement, his actions motivated by simple recognition that causing unnecessary pain to others was wrong regardless of whatever strategic advantages might be gained through such cruelty. The realization that someone could possess power sufficient to challenge her authority while choosing to use that strength for protection rather than domination created emotional earthquake that restructured fundamental assumptions she had developed about relationships between beauty, power, and the motivations that drove human behavior. The feelings that began developing during their brief time together represented first genuine attraction she had experienced since childhood, though the intensity of such emotions created vulnerability that her previous experiences had taught her to view as dangerous weakness that could be exploited by enemies who understood how to weaponize others' capacity for love. The participation in the Marineford War, on behalf of someone she barely knew but had already begun to love, demonstrated how completely her priorities had shifted from pure self-preservation and protection of her immediate community to encompass broader concerns that included welfare of individuals whose dreams aligned with values she had maintained despite trauma that might have justified abandoning such principles entirely. The battles she fought during that conflict were motivated not by obligation to official allies, but by personal commitment to ensuring survival of someone whose continued existence had become essential to her own sense of what made life meaningful. The healing care she provided to Luffy during his recovery from psychological wounds inflicted by Ace's death revealed nurturing instincts that had survived years of brutalization designed to eliminate such responses. Her willingness to expose vulnerability through genuine emotional investment, representing triumph over conditioning that had taught her to view all forms of attachment as potential sources of weakness that enemies could exploit. The intimate moments they shared during this period were characterized by tenderness that transcended physical attraction to encompass spiritual connection that neither had previously believed possible, given their respective backgrounds and circumstances. The protection she offered extended beyond immediate medical care to encompass training that would help him develop strength necessary for pursuing dreams that she understood were important enough to justify any sacrifice she might be required to make for their achievement. Her instruction in haki, techniques providing concrete demonstration of commitment that went far beyond romantic infatuation, to encompass genuine partnership with someone whose goals had become indistinguishable from her own deepest aspirations. The knowledge she shared represented investment in future that would necessarily involve separation during crucial periods when their individual responsibilities would prevent physical proximity but could not diminish emotional bonds that had been forged through shared understanding of what it meant to love someone more than oneself. The marine invasion of Amazon Lily that followed the dissolution of the warlord system represented direct threat to everything she had spent years building and protecting, though the tactical challenge it presented was complicated by recognition that her people's welfare required solutions that went beyond simple military victory to encompass long-term security that could not be achieved through conventional means. The decisions she made during this crisis reflected integration of protective instincts with strategic thinking that had been refined through experience with how power relationships actually functioned when survival became primary consideration, overriding all other concerns. The temporary alliance with Blackbeard represented compromise that violated every principle she claimed to hold sacred, though the practical benefits of such arrangement provided breathing room necessary for developing more permanent solutions to threats that could not be eliminated through direct confrontation with forces whose resources and capabilities exceeded anything her island could muster independently. The negotiations required careful balance between maintaining enough independence to preserve essential values while accepting sufficient constraint to avoid triggering responses that would result in complete destruction of everything she had fought to preserve throughout her adult life. The knowledge that such arrangements were temporary at best created urgency regarding preparation for conflicts that seemed increasingly inevitable as global power structures shifted in ways that would force everyone to choose sides in struggles whose outcomes would determine the shape of civilization for generations to come. The training she provided to her warriors during this period emphasized not just individual combat effectiveness, but collective coordination that would allow them to function as military unit, capable of defending their homeland against enemies whose strength exceeded anything they had previously faced, while maintaining cultural traditions that gave their resistance meaning beyond mere survival. The dreams that sustained her through periods of separation from Luffy were built around visions of a world where beauty could exist without inspiring violence, where strength could be used for protection without requiring constant vigilance against those who would exploit any sign of vulnerability and where love could be expressed freely without creating target for enemies who understood how to transform others' capacity for affection into weapons that could be used against them. The paradise she imagined was not retreat from reality, but evolution beyond current limitations toward possibilities that remained achievable for those who possessed sufficient courage to challenge systems that claimed permanent authority over human destiny. Standing now at the threshold of conflicts that would test every lesson she had learned through triumph and trauma, Boa Hancock represented complex intersection of vulnerability and strength that characterized individuals whose power derived not from emotional detachment, but from willingness to risk everything for protection of values that transcended personal safety, her serpentine grace concealing heart that had learned to love despite every reason her experiences had provided for choosing isolation over connection with others, whose welfare had become more important to her than her own survival in a world that showed little mercy to those who dared to believe that change was possible. In the depths of the ocean where sunlight fades into eternal twilight and the pressure of countless fathoms above creates conditions that would crush ordinary beings, there exists a realm where different forms of life have flourished for millennia beyond the understanding of those who dwell upon the surface world. It was in these mysterious depths that a young fishman first opened his eyes to possibilities that extended far beyond the boundaries his species had been taught to accept, though the circumstances of his birth would mark him as exceptional, even among a people whose physical capabilities far exceeded those of ordinary humans. Jinbei emerged into consciousness in the Ryugu Kingdom during an era when the relationship between fishmen and the surface world was defined by centuries of mutual mistrust and systematic oppression that had created wounds so deep that most believed they could never be healed through any concevable means. The underwater paradise of Fishman Island represented both sanctuary and prison for its inhabitants, the protective bubble that allowed them to maintain their civilization 10,000 meters beneath the waves, serving as barrier against hostile forces, while simultaneously isolating them from opportunities that might have led to greater understanding between species whose differences had been weaponized by those who profited from division and conflict. Young Jinbei grew up surrounded by stories of heroes and martyrs whose sacrifices had preserved their people's freedom, while listening to warnings about the surface dwellers whose hatred seemed as vast and implacable as the ocean itself, though his naturally contemplative nature led him to question whether such animosity was truly inevitable, or merely the result of ignorance and fear that could be overcome through patient effort and demonstrated goodwill. The discrimination he witnessed during his formative years was not the crude hostility that characterized interactions between different human ethnic groups, but something far more fundamental and systemic, rooted in biological differences that made integration seem impossible to those whose thinking had been shaped by centuries of evidence that peaceful coexistence was nothing more than naive fantasy pursued by idealists who refused to acknowledge the harsh realities of how power actually functioned. In a world where might determined right regardless of whatever moral principles might be proclaimed by those too weak to enforce their vision of justice, the slave markets that operated with government sanction provided daily reminders of how fishmen and mermaids were viewed by surface society, their treatment as exotic commodities rather than sentient beings, revealing depths of dehumanization that went beyond mere prejudice to encompass fundamental denial of their right to exist as anything other than entertainment for those whose wealth could purchase whatever forms of suffering might amuse them. The philosophy that began developing during his youth emphasized bridge building over barrier construction, though his approach was tempered by realistic understanding of how much resistance would be encountered from both sides of divides that had been carefully maintained by those whose interests were served by preventing the kind of cooperation that might challenge existing power structures. The strength that marked him as exceptional among his peers was accompanied by wisdom that recognized force alone could never achieve the kinds of changes that would be necessary for creating lasting peace. Though he also understood that pacifism without the capability for self-defense was merely an invitation for exploitation by those who viewed kindness as weakness to be taken advantage of whenever convenient. The decision to join the Sun Pirates under Fisher Tiger's leadership represented commitment to ideals that transcended simple revenge against surface dwellers who had perpetrated countless atrocities against his people. The organization's founding principles, emphasizing liberation of the oppressed, while actively working to break cycles of hatred that trapped both victims and oppressors in patterns of violence that served no constructive purpose, beyond providing temporary satisfaction for grievances that could never be fully addressed through retaliation. Tiger's own background as former slave provided credibility that pure theorists could never achieve. His first-hand knowledge of what surface cruelty looked like when applied systematically, creating foundation for strategies that combined moral authority with practical understanding of what methods might actually prove effective in changing hearts and minds rather than simply punishing enemies. The adventures that followed during his time as crew member aboard the ship that had become symbol of hope for fishermen throughout the world provided education in how complex realities actually were beyond the simplified narratives that both sides used to justify their positions. Encounters with surface dwellers, revealing spectrum of attitudes and behaviors that ranged from virulent hatred through indifference to genuine respect and friendship, that challenged assumptions he had been taught to accept as universal truths about human nature. The battles they fought were not just military engagements, but ideological struggles over what kinds of futures were possible for species whose differences had been transformed into weapons by those who benefited from maintaining artificial divisions between people whose cooperation might threaten established hierarchies. The relationship with Koala during her time with their crew demonstrated possibilities that most fishmen had dismissed as impossible. The young human girl's gradual recovery from trauma inflicted by her own species, while learning to trust those she had been taught to fear, providing concrete evidence that prejudices could be overcome when individuals were given opportunities to interact as people rather than representatives of groups whose characteristics had been defined by their enemies. Her eventual departure created mixed emotions that reflected complex realities of trying to build understanding across divides that most considered unbridgeable. The success of her integration with their crew serving as proof that change was possible, while her need to return to surface society demonstrated how much work remained to be done before such examples could become commonplace rather than rare exceptions. The transformation of the Sun Pirates following Fisher Tiger's death required navigation of philosophical and practical challenges that tested every principle their organization had claimed to represent. The choice between continuing their founder's vision of gradual progress toward mutual understanding or embracing the more militant approach that Arlong advocated, representing fundamental decision about what kinds of methods were acceptable in pursuit of justice that had been too long delayed. Jinbei's emergence as leader came through recognition by his crewmates that his combination of strength and wisdom provided the best hope for maintaining unity while pursuing objectives that honored Tiger's memory, without abandoning hope for eventually achieving the peaceful coexistence that had always been their ultimate goal. The decision to accept warlord status represented compromise that violated some of the principles that had originally motivated his involvement with the Sun Pirates. Though the protection such recognition would provide for Fishman Island and its inhabitants seemed to justify accepting collaboration with systems he despised if such cooperation could prevent greater suffering than principled resistance might achieve. The negotiations that led to his official recognition as government-sanctioned pirate required careful balance between maintaining enough independence to continue pursuing objectives that served his people's interests, while appearing sufficiently cooperative to convince authorities that his loyalty could be trusted within limits that remained undefined but clearly existed. The early years of his tenure as warlord were marked by meticulous fulfillment of official obligations, while secretly working to establish networks of communication and cooperation that might eventually provide foundation for more substantial progress toward the understanding he continued to believe was possible. Despite mounting evidence that most people on both sides preferred familiar hatred to uncertain peace that would require abandoning comfortable assumptions about their own moral superiority, the respect he gradually earned from Marine officers who had initially viewed his appointment with suspicion demonstrated that individual relationships could transcend group prejudices when built upon demonstrated competence and consistent reliability in fulfilling commitments that served mutual interests. The relationship with Portgas D. Ace that developed during the young pirate's time in his territory represented one of the most significant connections Jinbei formed with a surface dweller. The friendship that emerged between them, transcending species barriers to encompass mutual recognition of individuals whose strength was matched by genuine concern for protecting those who could not protect themselves. Ace's complete lack of prejudice against fishmen provided refreshing contrast to attitudes that Jinbei had learned to expect from most humans, while his growing reputation as member of Whitebeard's crew created opportunities for diplomatic contact with one of the world's most powerful organizations that might prove valuable for advancing broader goals of peaceful coexistence. The promise he made to Whitebeard regarding Ace's welfare represented commitment that went far beyond simple friendship to encompass recognition of how individual relationships could serve as foundation for larger changes in how different groups perceived and interacted with each other. His agreement to look after the young pirate reflecting understanding that some bonds transcended practical considerations to encompass moral obligations that could not be shirked without compromising fundamental values that gave life meaning beyond mere survival. The respect that Whitebeard showed for his character and judgment provided validation from source whose authority was recognized throughout Pirate World, while creating connections that might eventually prove useful for advancing causes that served interests larger than immediate tactical advantage. The Marineford War that erupted following Ace's capture presented Jinbei with impossible choice between official obligations as warlord and personal commitments that had been forged through years of friendship and mutual respect, the conflict forcing him to decide whether loyalty to systems that provided protection for his people was more important than honoring promises made to individuals whose welfare had become integral to his own sense of moral integrity. The decision to abandon his government sanction in favor of supporting rescue attempt represented triumph of personal values over political expedience, though he understood that such choice would have consequences extending far beyond immediate battle to encompass long-term relationships between Fishman Island and world government authorities who would not forgive what they viewed as betrayal during crucial moment when their interests required absolute loyalty from subordinates. The battles he fought during that war were motivated not by hatred for Marine forces or particular affection for Whitebeard's organization, but by recognition that some principles were worth defending regardless of personal cost or strategic disadvantage. His combat performance, demonstrating capabilities that had been refined through decades of experience, while his tactical decisions revealed wisdom that came from understanding how individual actions could influence larger historical processes. The moment when he threw Luffy toward the three admirals represented perfect synthesis of calculated risk and intuitive understanding of character. His confidence in the young pirate's ability to survive such encounter, reflecting recognition of qualities that transcended mere combat effectiveness to encompass spiritual strength that could not be measured through conventional means. The rescue operations that followed Ace's death required skills that went beyond simple fighting ability to encompass medical knowledge and psychological understanding necessary for treating wounds that were emotional as well as physical. Jinbei's care for Luffy during his recovery, demonstrating nurturing instincts that had survived decades of violence while revealing depths of compassion that his opponents had never suspected existed beneath exterior that emphasized strength and martial capability. The conversations they shared during this period created bonds that would influence both their futures in ways neither could fully understand at the time. The connection transcending species differences to encompass recognition of kindred spirits, whose commitment to protecting others provided common ground more solid than any superficial similarities or differences in background or appearance. The decision to join the Straw Hat Pirates represented culmination of gradual evolution in his understanding of how change could best be achieved in a world where established systems seemed designed to prevent the kind of progress that his entire life had been dedicated to advancing. His recognition that Luffy possessed qualities necessary for challenging existing order, while maintaining moral principles that prevented such power from becoming mere tool for replacing one form of oppression with another. The invitation he accepted carried weight that extended far beyond personal adventure to encompass participation in movement that might actually achieve goals that had seemed impossible when pursued through conventional diplomatic channels, or military action directed against symptoms rather than underlying causes. The integration into their crew required adjustments on both sides, as individuals whose backgrounds and experiences differed dramatically learned to function as coordinated unit while maintaining respect for differences that created strength through diversity rather than weakness through division. His role as helmsman, providing both practical contribution to their success and symbolic representation of how different species could work together when united by shared values and mutual commitment to objectives that transcended narrow self-interest. The wisdom he provided during their subsequent adventures drew upon decades of experience with how good intentions could go wrong when not supported by adequate understanding of complex forces that shaped world events in ways that pure idealism alone could never adequately address. The cover story that revealed ancient ruins beneath the ocean during one of his solo adventures provided glimpses into historical connections that suggested current conflicts were merely latest chapters in struggles that had been ongoing for centuries. The archaeological evidence, raising questions about what had been lost when different species had been convinced to view each other as natural enemies rather than potential allies, whose cooperation might have prevented many of the tragedies that had shaped subsequent development. The knowledge gained from such discoveries added new dimensions to his understanding of what might be possible if barriers that seemed natural and inevitable could be recognized as artificial constructions maintained by those who benefited from division and conflict. The connection between his facial scar and similar markings worn by Rox D. Zebek represented either remarkable coincidence or evidence of deeper patterns that linked individuals across generations and species boundaries through shared experiences or common purposes that remained hidden from casual observation, the similarity suggesting possibilities for influence and connection that operated according to principles different from those that govern surface relationships between people whose interactions were mediated through official channels and formal organizations. The implications of such connections remained unclear, though they suggested that his role in current events might be more significant than even he understood, while his knowledge of historical matters might prove crucial for understanding what was at stake in conflicts that seemed to be approaching some kind of climactic resolution. The relationship with Who's Who that emerged during the Wano conflict revealed how his reputation had been shaped by events and interpretations that went beyond his actual involvement in specific incidents. The former CP agent's resentment over career damage that had resulted from Luffy's escape, creating personal animosity that reflected larger tensions between different approaches to addressing species-based prejudice and systematic oppression. The battle that resolved their conflict demonstrated both his combat capabilities and his philosophical commitment to methods that emphasize protection rather than revenge, his victory serving broader purposes than simple personal vindication to encompass statement about what kinds of responses were appropriate when confronted with hatred that stemmed from ignorance rather than genuine evil. The current period represents a moment when lessons learned through decades of bridge building and diplomatic effort must be integrated with recognition that some problems cannot be solved through patient negotiation with those who benefit from maintaining status quo. His position within Straw Hat Crew providing platform for pursuing changes that might have remained impossible when approached through conventional channels that required compromise with systems whose fundamental nature prevented the kinds of reforms that justice demanded. The helmsman who guides their ship through treacherous waters serves similar function in navigating political and social currents that threaten to overwhelm those who lack experience with how to maintain course toward objectives that remain worthwhile, despite obstacles that seem designed to discourage anyone who dares to hope that meaningful change is possible. The dreams that sustain him through current challenges are built around visions of world where Fishman Island exists, not as isolated sanctuary, but as integral part of global community, where differences are celebrated rather than weaponized, where children of all species can grow up without learning to hate those whose appearances differ from their own, and where strength is used for protection and cooperation, rather than domination and exploitation of those whose circumstances make them vulnerable to abuse by those who possess superior resources or capabilities. The paradise he works toward is not retreat from reality but evolution beyond current limitations toward possibilities that remain achievable for those who possess sufficient patience and wisdom to build understanding one relationship at a time while never losing sight of larger goals that give individual efforts meaning beyond immediate circumstances. Standing now at the helm of dreams made manifest in wood and steel, Jinbei represents perfect synthesis of strength and wisdom that allows true progress to be made in world where force alone can never achieve lasting change, while pure idealism without practical capability remains forever vulnerable to those who understand how power actually functions. His massive hands steady on the wheel that guides them toward futures where his life's work might finally bear fruit in forms that honor both the sacrifices made by previous generations and the hopes that sustain those who continue, believing that tomorrow can be better than today. In the darkest corners of ambition where dreams twist into nightmares and the pursuit of power consumes everything that once made life meaningful, there exists a figure whose very name has become synonymous with the kind of calculated evil that emerges when intelligence is wedded to absolute ruthlessness in service of goals that transcend conventional understanding of what any single individual should dare to attempt. Marshall D. Teach entered the world bearing, within his unusual physiology, the seeds of destiny that would reshape the balance of power across all the seas. Though the circumstances of his birth on an island whose name has been deliberately obscured from historical records suggest origins that were neither humble nor entirely conventional, his early years marked by signs that even then hinted at the extraordinary nature of what he would eventually become. The body that housed his consciousness was unlike anything that medical science had previously documented, possessing characteristics that allowed him to survive and even thrive under conditions that would prove fatal to ordinary humans. His unusual anatomy, creating possibilities for development that existed nowhere else in the natural world, while simultaneously marking him as fundamentally different from those around him in ways that would influence every relationship he formed throughout his remarkable and terrible life. The darkness that seemed to gather around him even as a child was not merely metaphorical, but represented genuine alteration in how light and shadow interacted with his presence, as if reality itself recognized him as agent of forces that operated according to principles different from those that governed normal existence. The island where he spent his formative years was populated by individuals whose own backgrounds suggested connections to events and organizations that preferred to remain hidden from the attention of those who claimed authority over the dais. World's official history, the community that raised him, providing education that encompassed not just practical skills necessary for survival in dangerous waters, but philosophical frameworks that viewed conventional morality as luxury that could not be afforded by those who sought to achieve meaningful change in systems designed to prevent such transformation. The stories he heard during childhood emphasized the importance of seizing opportunities, regardless of whatever costs might be imposed upon others, his mentors teaching him that strength was the only currency that retained value when circumstances became desperate enough to strip away pretense and reveal the fundamental nature of human interaction. The hunger that drove him, even during his youth, was not mere appetite for food or comfort, but something far more profound and dangerous, an emptiness that could never be filled through ordinary means, because it stemmed from understanding that existence itself was incomplete without the kind of power that could reshape reality according to his will, rather than accepting whatever limitations had been imposed by forces beyond his control. The dreams that sustained him through periods of hardship and preparation were built around visions of dominion that extended far beyond simple conquest to encompass fundamental alteration of how the world functioned, his ambitions operating on scales that made other pirates' goals seem modest by comparison, while his methods demonstrated willingness to embrace whatever moral compromises might be necessary for achieving such unprecedented objectives. The decision to seek position aboard Whitebeard's ship represented strategic calculation rather than genuine desire for camaraderie or adventure. His recognition that the strongest pirate crew in the world would provide access to information and opportunities that could never be obtained through independent operation, while allowing him to observe at close range how true power functioned when wielded by someone whose capabilities approached the legendary. The decades he spent serving as loyal crew member required suppression of his natural inclinations toward leadership and dominance, his performance of subordination so convincing that even Whitebeard himself never suspected the depths of ambition that lay concealed beneath exterior that emphasized reliability and modest competence rather than the kind of exceptional abilities that might have attracted unwanted attention. The patience he demonstrated during this extended period of apparent civility was perhaps his most remarkable characteristic, his willingness to spend 26 years waiting for the right opportunity to present itself, revealing discipline that few individuals could maintain when confronted with daily reminders of how much power was within their reach if they were willing to abandon principles that others considered essential for maintaining their humanity. The specific devil fruit that he sought existed somewhere in the vast ocean, its location unknown, but its eventual discovery inevitable for someone who possessed sufficient determination to continue searching. Regardless of how long such quest might require, his confidence in ultimate success, stemming from understanding that patience was weapon more powerful than any immediate application of force. The yami yami no mi that would provide foundation for everything he hoped to achieve represented more than simple enhancement of his already considerable capabilities. The darkness. It granted access to operating according to principles that transcended conventional understanding of how devil fruit powers functioned, while offering possibilities that seemed to exist outside normal limitations imposed upon those who consumed such mysterious substances. The gravitational effects that emerged from his transformed body were merely surface manifestations of deeper alterations that allowed him to interact with fundamental forces that shaped reality itself. His growing mastery of these abilities, revealing layers of existence that remained hidden from those whose perception was limited to immediately visible phenomena. The murder of Thatch represented crossing of threshold from which there could be no return, his betrayal of crewmate, who had shown him nothing but friendship and respect, demonstrating willingness to sacrifice any relationship that stood between him and objectives that had become more important to him than conventional human bonds. Though the efficiency with which he accomplished this task spoke to preparation that had been ongoing for years before opportunity finally presented itself. The devil fruit that he claimed through this act of ultimate treachery was not just prize to be possessed, but key that would unlock potential that had remained dormant within his unusual physiology until circumstances aligned to permit its full expression. The escape from Whitebeard's territory required skills that went beyond simple combat effectiveness to encompass strategic thinking that could account for pursuit by forces whose capabilities he understood better than anyone else. Alive, his successful evasion of immediate retaliation, providing time necessary for beginning to explore implications of power that operated according to rules he was still learning to manipulate. The crew that he assembled during this period consisted of individuals whose own backgrounds and motivations aligned with his vision of what could be achieved through coordinated application of abilities that conventional pirates had never thought to combine in service of objectives that most would consider impossible. The formation of the Blackbeard Pirates represented more than simple recruitment of subordinates, but careful construction of organization whose members possessed complementary skills that created collective capabilities exceeding what any individual could achieve independently. His approach to leadership, emphasizing results over methods while maintaining loyalty through combination of shared benefits and realistic understanding of what alternatives were available to people whose particular talents made them unsuitable for conventional employment. The ship that carried them toward their first major objective was filled not with traditional pirate revelry, but with focused preparation for undertaking that would test every aspect of their coordination while establishing their reputation as force capable of challenging established order. The hunt for Port Gasti. Ace was motivated by practical considerations regarding what rewards capture of such high-value target might provide, rather than personal animosity towards someone he had known during their time serving under the same captain. His willingness to pursue former crewmate demonstrating how completely he had severed emotional connections that might have interfered with rational calculation of what actions would best serve his long-term interests. The battle that ultimately resulted in Ace's defeat showcased capabilities that had been refined through decades of preparation. Though victory came through exploitation of tactical advantages rather than overwhelming superiority in direct combat, his understanding of how different devil fruit powers interacted, allowing him to neutralize abilities that might otherwise have proven decisive. The presentation of his captive to marine authorities represented masterful manipulation of government systems that preferred to deal with pirates who could be relied upon to serve official interests when such cooperation provided mutual benefits. His acceptance of warlord status opening doors that would have remained closed to someone who operated entirely outside established frameworks, while providing legal protection that allowed him to pursue objectives that served his personal agenda rather than governmental policy. The respect that this achievement earned from other pirates demonstrated how thoroughly he had established himself as genuine threat to existing power structures, while his apparent cooperation with authorities created confusion among those who attempted to predict his future actions based on conventional understanding of how such arrangements typically functioned. The infiltration of Impel Down represented perhaps his most audacious operation, the penetration of fortress that had never been breached, requiring not just combat capabilities but intimate knowledge of systems and procedures that could only be obtained through sources that few individuals possessed access to. His success in reaching level 6 demonstrating preparation that had accounted for obstacles that would have stopped less thorough planners. The prisoners he liberated from eternal imprisonment were not chosen randomly, but represented careful selection of individuals whose particular skills and motivations made them valuable additions to organization that intended to challenge forces whose power had previously seemed unassailable. The recruitment process that he employed within the underwater prison revealed sophisticated understanding of human psychology and the kinds of appeals that could motivate people whose circumstances had reduced them to desperation. His ability to inspire loyalty among those who had been abandoned by everyone else, providing foundation for expansion that transformed his crew from promising upstarts into legitimate threat to established order. The alliances he forged during this period were built upon shared recognition that conventional methods had failed to achieve objectives that remained worth pursuing through alternative approaches that others might consider unacceptable. The participation in the Marineford War represented culmination of planning that had been developing since his initial betrayal of Whitebeard's trust, the conflict providing perfect opportunity to eliminate source of his greatest vulnerability, while simultaneously acquiring power that would establish him as force capable of competing with anyone in the world for ultimate dominion. The battle that followed tested every aspect of his development, while providing stage for demonstrating capabilities that few had suspected he possessed. His performance during the war's climactic moments, revealing both tactical brilliance and ruthless determination to seize whatever opportunities presented themselves, regardless of conventional constraints regarding honor or loyalty. The theft of Whitebeard's Gura Gura no Mi represented achievement that defied everything most people understood about how devil fruit powers functioned. His successful acquisition of abilities that should have been lost upon their previous user's death, demonstrating mastery of principles that existed beyond normal limitations while providing concrete evidence that his unusual physiology allowed him to transcend rules that applied to everyone else. The earthquakes that resulted from his experiments with these new capabilities served notice to the world that power relationships that had seemed permanent were now subject to revision by someone whose ambitions operated on scales that made previous threats seem modest by comparison. The rise to emperor status that followed represented recognition by both allies and enemies that he had achieved position from which he could challenge anyone for dominion over territories and resources that had previously been considered the exclusive province of those whose reputations had been built through decades of successful operation at the highest levels of pirate society. The expansion of his territory and influence during this period was accomplished through methods that combined diplomatic negotiation with strategic application of overwhelming force, his approach demonstrating understanding that lasting power required both respect and fear from those who might otherwise challenge his authority. The philosophy that guided his approach to leadership and conquest emphasized dreams as fundamental force that drove human development, while simultaneously recognizing that such aspirations could never be achieved through passive waiting for favorable circumstances to emerge naturally, his worldview requiring active intervention in historical processes to create conditions that would permit realization of visions that conventional wisdom dismissed as impossible fantasies. The speeches he delivered to subordinates and rivals alike carried weight of absolute conviction in principles that had been refined through decades of experience, with how power actually functioned when stripped of romantic notions about honor and justice that served primarily to comfort those too weak to acknowledge harsh realities. The contrast between his methods and those employed by Monkey D. Luffy represented fundamental philosophical divide between individuals whose dreams required entirely different approaches to achieving objectives that might appear similar on surface but stemmed from values that could never be reconciled through compromise or negotiation, where Luffy sought to protect and inspire others through example of what was possible when strength was used responsibly. Teach understood that meaningful change required elimination of obstacles through whatever means proved most effective, regardless of moral considerations that served no practical purpose in a world where results mattered more than methods employed to achieve them. The current period represents a moment when decades of preparation and strategic positioning must be converted into concrete action that will determine whether his vision of reordered world can be implemented through available resources or whether forces arrayed against him possess sufficient strength to prevent transformation that would necessarily involve destruction of systems that many consider essential for maintaining civilization itself. The territories under his control provide foundation for military operations whose scale and coordination exceed anything previously attempted by individual pirate organization, while his knowledge of government vulnerabilities creates possibilities for achieving objectives that conventional conquest could never accomplish. The ancient weapons that remain hidden throughout the world represent tools that could provide decisive advantage in conflicts whose outcomes will determine the shape of human society for generations to come. His understanding of their locations and capabilities derived from sources that few others can access, while his willingness to employ such devices demonstrates commitment to achieving victory, regardless of whatever collateral damage might result from their deployment. The research he has conducted into historical precedents for the kind of transformation he envisions suggests that current systems are not permanent fixtures, but temporary arrangements that can be altered through sufficient application of force and intelligence directed toward vulnerable points that their architects never anticipated would be discovered. The dreams that sustain him through current challenges are built around visions of world where strength determines hierarchy and weakness is eliminated through natural selection that operates without interference from artificial constraints designed to protect those who lack capability to defend themselves. His ultimate goal being establishment of order that acknowledges reality of power, relationships, rather than maintaining comfortable illusions that serve primarily to delay inevitable confrontations between forces whose differences cannot be resolved through peaceful negotiation. The darkness that he commands continues to expand its influence throughout territories under his control, while his growing mastery of multiple devil fruit abilities creates tactical possibilities that no previous opponent has ever been forced to confront in battle, whose outcome will determine whether existing civilization survives or gives way to something entirely different. Standing now at the pinnacle of power that he has spent his entire life climbing toward, Marshal D. Teach represents perfect synthesis of ambition and capability that makes him perhaps the most dangerous individual in a world where danger has become the normal condition of existence for anyone whose dreams extend beyond simple survival. His unusual form casting shadows that seem to contain within them hints of futures that most people would prefer never to see realized, but which may prove inevitable if his understanding of how history actually functions proves more accurate than the hopes of those who continue believing that good intentions alone can overcome forces that recognize no authority beyond their own relentless will to dominate everything that exists. In the shadows cast by greater legends, where the stories of those who shaped history through briefer but no less significant contributions often fade from memory, there exist tales of warlords whose time upon the stage was measured not in decades but in moments of crisis that revealed character forged through circumstances that had pushed them far beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience. These forgotten architects of change carried within their hearts dreams and burdens that drove them toward destinies they could never have imagined during the innocence of youth, their paths converging with the great currents of history at precisely the moments when individual choice could determine the fate of countless others whose lives hung in the balance between hope and despair. Edward Weevil emerged from obscurity, bearing a name that carried weight far beyond anything his appearance might have suggested to those who encountered him without understanding the complex legacy that had shaped his existence from its very beginning. His massive form and distinctive facial hair, creating resemblance to the legendary Whitebeard that was too striking to be dismissed as mere coincidence, yet too improbable to be accepted without question by those whose experience had taught them to be suspicious of claims that seemed designed to exploit emotional connections to figures whose reputations had transcended their mortal limitations. The circumstances of his birth remained shrouded in mystery that his mother seemed determined to preserve through a combination of deliberate obscurity and selective revelation that provided just enough information to support her claims, while withholding details that might have allowed independent verification of stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. Miss Bucking, the diminutive woman whose influence over her supposed son exceeded anything that normal parent-child relationships could explain, carried herself with the confidence of someone who possessed knowledge that others would pay dearly to acquire. Her connections to events and individuals from eras when the world's power structures had been fundamentally different, suggesting background that extended far beyond the humble circumstances she typically claimed as her origin. The stories she told about her relationship with Edward Newgate were delivered with conviction that spoke to either genuine experience or masterful deception, though the specific details she provided demonstrated familiarity with aspects of the legendary pirate's life that few outside his immediate circle could have known without direct involvement in events that had been carefully concealed from historical records. The possibility that Weevil represented genuine offspring of the world's strongest man created implications that extended far beyond questions of inheritance or legal succession to encompass fundamental issues regarding what kinds of capabilities could be passed from one generation to the next, through biological processes that remained poorly understood even by those who studied such matters professionally. The strength he demonstrated during his brief career as independent pirate suggested potential that operated on scales comparable to his alleged father's abilities, though the crude application of such power revealed lack of training and philosophical development that Whitebeard himself had possessed in abundance during his prime years of terrorizing enemies and protecting those he considered family. The alternative explanation that his existence resulted from scientific experimentation rather than natural reproduction, aligned with evidence regarding Miss Bucking's connections to research organizations that had explored possibilities for creating enhanced humans through methods that combined genetic manipulation with technological augmentation. Her membership in the original MADS group, providing access to knowledge and resources that could have produced individuals whose capabilities exceeded normal human limitations, while their origins remained concealed through careful management of information that might have revealed uncomfortable truths about how far such research had progressed. The destruction he wreaked upon crews that had once served under Whitebeard's protection demonstrated both formidable combat abilities and psychological dysfunction that prevented him from distinguishing between legitimate targets, innocent victims. His attacks, motivated by combination of genuine belief in his right to claim his father's legacy and manipulation by mother figure whose own agenda remained hidden beneath layers of apparent maternal concern. The battles that followed his emergence as independent force were characterized by overwhelming applications of strength that left little room for strategic thinking or tactical innovation. His approach to combat emphasizing brute force over the kind of sophisticated techniques that had made his alleged father legendary among those who understood the subtleties of high-level warfare. The recruitment as warlord occurred during a period when world government authorities were desperately seeking individuals whose capabilities could help maintain balance of power that had been disrupted by recent changes in global situation. His acceptance into their ranks, representing pragmatic decision that prioritized immediate utility over careful evaluation of long-term reliability or moral character. The legal protection that such status provided was less important to him than official recognition that validated his claims regarding his heritage, though the responsibilities that accompanied such position proved beyond his ability to fulfill in ways that served governmental interests rather than his own immediate desires for recognition and revenge. The campaign he waged against former allies of Whitebeard was conducted with systematic brutality that shocked even observers who had become accustomed to violence as normal feature of pirate conflicts. His inability to recognize distinction between legitimate military targets and non-combatants, revealing fundamental deficiency in moral development that had never been addressed during whatever process had created his exceptional physical capabilities. The crews that fell before his assault included individuals whose only crime had been loyalty to memory of man they had served with dedication that transcended simple employment to encompass genuine family bonds that death had not been able to sever. The capture that ended his brief career as active pirate came through coordinated effort by Marine forces, who had finally recognized that his activities were creating more problems than his official status was worth. Though the operation required careful planning and overwhelming numerical superiority to overcome advantages that his raw strength provided in direct confrontation with opponents who lacked comparable physical capabilities. The imprisonment that followed was complicated by questions regarding what kind of containment would be sufficient for someone whose abilities had never been properly tested against facilities designed for holding individuals whose power operated on scales that exceeded normal human limitations. The potential for escape that his current situation represented created ongoing security concerns that required constant vigilance from authorities, whose resources were already stretched beyond comfortable limits by demands created through recent changes in global power structures. His continued existence serving as reminder that some problems could not be permanently solved through conventional applications of force, but required more sophisticated approaches that addressed underlying causes rather than merely containing symptoms. The relationships he might form with other prisoners whose own backgrounds included connections to organizations and individuals whose objectives aligned with his desires for recognition and revenge created possibilities for coordination that could transform individual escape attempt into broader challenge to systems that depended upon maintaining control over dangerous elements that conventional methods had failed to eliminate. Trafalgar Law's journey toward temporary membership among the Seven Warlords began in circumstances that would have destroyed lesser individuals before they reached adolescence. The systematic extermination of his homeland's population through policies that prioritized economic interests over human welfare, providing education in how established authorities functioned when their decisions were shielded from accountability by distance and bureaucratic structures that diffused responsibility among so many individuals that no single person could be held responsible for consequences that everyone involved had understood were inevitable. The white lead that had brought prosperity to Flevance carried within its beautiful surface poison that would claim every life that had been enriched through its extraction. The tragic irony of this situation, providing foundation for understanding that would shape every subsequent decision he made regarding trust and cooperation, with systems that claimed benevolent intent while pursuing policies that served interests fundamentally opposed to human welfare. The child who survived the destruction of everything he had ever known did so through combination of luck and determination that was sustained by rage, too pure to be diminished by trauma that would have reduced most people to catatonic withdrawal from reality that offered nothing but evidence of how quickly security could be transformed into nightmare through forces beyond individual control. The disease that should have killed him within months or years instead became constant companion whose presence served as daily reminder of what had been lost and what debts remained unpaid to those whose suffering had been dismissed as acceptable cost for maintaining systems that benefited people who would never face comparable consequences for their decisions. The rescue that came through Don Quixote Rocinante represented intervention by someone whose own moral development had been shaped by witness to corruption and cruelty that characterized the organization he served. His willingness to sacrifice career and eventually life for welfare of child he barely knew, demonstrating kind of selfless dedication that Law had not believed could exist in a world that seemed designed to reward selfishness and punish altruism. The months they spent together while searching for cure that might halt progression of disease that conventional medicine had dismissed as invariably fatal, provided education in how individual choice could create meaning, even in circumstances that seemed designed to eliminate hope through constant demonstration of how powerless ordinary people were against forces that operated on scales beyond their ability to influence. The Opope no Mi that would define his adult capabilities came into his possession through sacrifice that revealed depths of love that Rocinante had never directly expressed through words. His final gift, providing both practical tool for survival and emotional foundation that would sustain Law through years of development that followed. The surgical abilities that emerged from mastery of this devil fruit were limited only by imagination and technical knowledge. His growing expertise revealing possibilities for healing and destruction that operated according to principles that conventional understanding of medicine had never contemplated as achievable through individual effort supported by supernatural enhancement. The formation of the Heart Pirates represented more than simple crew assembly, but creation of family unit whose bonds were forged through shared commitment to objectives that transcended personal advancement or material gain. His recruitment of subordinates, emphasizing character and reliability over pure combat effectiveness, while maintaining standards that ensured their collective capabilities would be sufficient for pursuing goals that required coordination and trust rather than simple aggregation of individual strengths. The submarine that carried them through their adventures was both vessel and sanctuary, its design reflecting understanding that their missions would often require operation in environments where conventional support systems were unavailable or compromised by hostile forces. The medical expertise that he developed alongside his devil fruit abilities provided foundation for reputation that extended far beyond simple combat effectiveness to encompass healing capabilities that made him valuable ally for those who understood that warfare inevitably produced casualties, whose survival depended upon access to treatment that exceeded what ordinary physicians could provide under field conditions. The operations he performed were often conducted under circumstances that would have been impossible for conventionally trained surgeons, his supernatural abilities allowing him to achieve results that bordered on miraculous, while his understanding of anatomy and pathology provided scientific foundation that prevented reliance upon fruit powers from compromising medical judgment that required careful evaluation of what could and should be attempted. The alliance with the Straw Hat Pirates that would ultimately lead to his brief tenure as warlord emerged from recognition that certain objectives could only be achieved through cooperation with individuals whose strength and moral character had been proven through trials that revealed their true nature. His assessment of Luffy's capabilities and motivations convincing him that partnership with someone whose approach to problem solving operated according to principles different from his own might create possibilities that neither could access independently. The plan that emerged from their collaboration combined his strategic thinking with Luffy's innovative responses to immediate challenges, while both contributed specialized skills that proved essential for achieving results that conventional approaches had failed to produce. The warlord status he accepted was never intended as permanent arrangement but tactical expedient that would provide access to resources and information necessary for pursuing personal vendettas that had been developing since childhood. His official cooperation with government authorities serving purposes that aligned with their immediate interests while concealing agenda that would ultimately require actions they would consider treasonous if they understood what he actually intended to accomplish. The brief period during which he held this position provided opportunities to gather intelligence and establish connections that proved invaluable when circumstances required abandonment of legal protections in favor of direct action that could not be accomplished through official channels. The confrontation with Doflamingo that would ultimately cost him his warlord status represented culmination of planning that had consumed years of preparation, his understanding that victory would require more than individual strength, leading him to coordinate efforts with allies whose own motivations aligned with his objectives, while their combined capabilities created tactical possibilities that his enemy had not anticipated. The battle that followed tested every aspect of his development, while providing opportunity to repay debts that had been accumulating interest for over a decade, though the satisfaction of achieving such long-sought revenge was tempered by recognition that some wounds could never be fully healed, regardless of what justice might be achieved against those who had inflicted them. The current period represents transition from pursuit of personal objectives toward participation in conflicts whose outcomes will determine the shape of civilization for generations to come. His unique position as member of the mysterious D clan, suggesting connections to historical processes that extend far beyond individual concerns to encompass fundamental questions about what kind of world will emerge from struggles between forces that represent entirely different visions of how power should be exercised and what purposes human strength should serve. The immortality surgery that his devil fruit makes possible remains option that could influence outcomes of conflicts whose stakes transcend anything that has been seen before, though the decision of whether and when to employ such capabilities will depend upon circumstances that have not yet crystallized into patterns that would allow rational evaluation of what choices would best serve causes that have become more important than personal survival. The knowledge he possesses regarding the true history of the world and the forces that have shaped current circumstances provides perspective that few others can match. His understanding of connections between past events and present conflicts, suggesting possibilities for intervention that could alter trajectories that most people consider inevitable. The submarine that carries him toward whatever destiny awaits continues to serve as platform for operations that combine medical expertise with tactical innovation, his crew's loyalty providing foundation for achievements that individual capability alone could never accomplish in a world where cooperation has become essential for survival. Standing now at the intersection of personal history and global transformation, these forgotten warlords represent complex interplay between individual dreams and historical necessity that characterizes those who find themselves positioned to influence events whose significance exceeds anything their origins might have prepared them to understand, their stories serving as reminder that even the briefest appearances upon history's stage can create ripples that continue expanding long after the individuals who generated them have passed beyond the immediate notice of those who would measure importance through duration rather than impact. In the grand theatre of pirate legend, where the most extraordinary achievements are often born from the most unlikely circumstances, no story captures the beautiful absurdity of fate quite like that of Buggy the Clown, a man whose remarkable journey from comic relief to one of the 4 emperors of the sea represents perhaps the most improbable rise to power in the entire history of maritime adventure. His tale begins not in the humble origins that typically characterize such dramatic transformations, but aboard the ship of the most legendary pirate who ever lived, where a young cabin boy with dreams of treasure and glory would accidentally consume a devil fruit that seemed more curse than blessing, setting in motion a chain of events so preposterous that even the most imaginative storyteller would hesitate to present them as plausible fiction. The Oro Jackson that carried him through his formative years was more than simple vessel, but floating university, where the greatest pirates of an era shared their knowledge with the next generation. The crew that surrounded young Buggy, representing concentration of talent and experience that would never again be assembled under a single flag. The education he received during those crucial years encompassed not just practical skills necessary for survival in dangerous waters, but philosophical understanding of what it meant to pursue dreams that seemed impossible to everyone, except those brave enough or foolish enough to attempt their realization. Though his natural tendency toward materialistic concerns meant that many of these deeper lessons remained unabsorbed until much later, when circumstances would force their relevance upon his unwilling consciousness. The friendship that developed between him and Shanks during their shared service created bonds that would endure through decades of separation and dramatically different approaches to achieving their respective goals. their childhood camaraderie built upon mutual recognition of kindred spirits whose dreams burned with equal intensity despite the very different forms those aspirations would eventually take. The competitions they engaged in were motivated by genuine affection disguised as rivalry, each pushing the other toward excellence, while their complementary personalities created dynamic that brought out qualities in both that might never have emerged through solitary development. The devil fruit incident that would reshape his entire existence occurred during one of their treasure hunting expeditions. His consumption of the Bara Bara no Mi, representing the kind of cosmic joke that seemed to characterize his relationship with destiny throughout his remarkable career. The ability to separate his body parts at will appeared initially to be nothing more than an amusing party trick that might provide entertainment value, but offered little practical advantage in serious combat situations. Though his growing mastery of these capabilities would eventually reveal tactical possibilities that more conventionally powerful opponents consistently underestimated to their eventual regret. The realization that his devil fruit consumption had cost him the ability to swim in the very element that covered 7/10 of the world he hoped to explore created existential crisis that was compounded by understanding that the created treasure map he had been studying when the accident occurred was now lost forever beneath waters he could never again enter without risking immediate death. This double loss of both fundamental capability and specific opportunity might have crushed the spirit of someone whose attachment to their dreams was less absolute, though Buggy's response was characteristically pragmatic acceptance that such setbacks were simply obstacles to be overcome through alternative methods that his natural creativity would eventually discover. The execution of Goldie, Roger, that marked the end of an era and the beginning of the great age of piracy, provided Buggy with final lesson from the captain, who had shaped his understanding of what it meant to pursue impossible dreams with absolute dedication. The Pirate King's final words transforming what might have been conclusion into prologue for adventures that would dwarf anything the previous generation had achieved. The inspiration he drew from witnessing his former captain's death was complicated by recognition that even the greatest achievements carried within them seeds of their own termination, though this knowledge only strengthened his determination to claim whatever treasures he could accumulate before similar fate overtook his own ambitions. The early years of his independent piracy were characterized by modest successes, punctuated by spectacular failures that somehow never quite eliminated his crew's faith in his leadership or his own confidence that eventual triumph was simply matter of persistence and better planning. The operations he conducted emphasized careful intelligence gathering and strategic timing over the kind of direct confrontation that had made his former captain legendary. His understanding that his current capabilities were insufficient for matching such examples, leading him to develop alternative approaches that maximized his strengths, while minimizing exposure to enemies whose power exceeded his ability to handle through conventional means. The recruitment process he employed during this period revealed sophisticated understanding of human nature and the kinds of appeals that could motivate individuals whose own dreams had been disappointed or deferred by circumstances beyond their control. His ability to inspire loyalty among subordinates who possessed superior combat abilities, speaking to charismatic leadership that operated through encouragement and shared vision rather than fear or intimidation. The crew that gradually assembled around him was bound together by genuine affection and mutual respect that created operational effectiveness, exceeding what their individual capabilities might have suggested to outside observers who focused on surface competencies rather than deeper bonds that sustained them through hardships. The encounter with Monkey D. Luffy in Orangetown represented first serious challenge to his authority that he had faced since establishing himself as independent captain. The young pirate's complete immunity to his psychological warfare tactics, forcing recognition that his understanding of how to intimidate opponents was incomplete when confronted by individuals whose worldview had been shaped by influences that made conventional approaches to fear-based manipulation ineffective. The battle that followed revealed both his tactical adaptability and the limitations that his devil fruit powers imposed when deployed against enemies who possessed sufficient determination to overcome initial surprise through persistent effort and innovative counter-strategies. The defeat he suffered during that confrontation was educational rather than devastating, his survival and eventual escape providing opportunities to analyze what had gone wrong while developing improved techniques that would prevent similar failures in future engagements with opponents whose abilities operated according to principles he had not previously encountered. The experience taught him valuable lessons about overconfidence and the importance of gathering more complete intelligence before committing to courses of action that could not be easily abandoned when circumstances proved different from initial assumptions. The period that followed saw gradual refinement of his approach to leadership and combat that incorporated lessons learned through direct experience with how quickly situations could change when unexpected variables entered equations that had seemed straightforward during planning phases. The reputation he built during these years was founded upon reliability rather than spectacular achievement. His consistent success in relatively modest undertakings, creating trust among allies and cautious respect among enemies, who understood that underestimating him could prove costly, even when his objectives seemed limited by conventional standards. The invitation to join Cross Guild represented recognition by former warlords whose own circumstances had been altered by government policy changes that his particular combination of skills and reputation made him valuable partner in organization whose goals required coordination between individuals whose approaches to problem-solving differed dramatically, while their collective capabilities created possibilities that none could achieve independently. The structure that emerged from these negotiations reflected careful balance between his natural tendency toward theatrical leadership and the practical necessities that effective cooperation demanded when dealing with personalities as strong as those possessed by Mihawk and Crocodile. The misunderstanding that led to his designation as Emperor of the Sea was perhaps inevitable given the world's tendency to interpret complex situations according to simplified narratives that emphasized easily understood hierarchies over the more nuanced realities of how power actually functioned within organizations, whose internal dynamics remained hidden from external observation. The terror that this unexpected elevation inspired within his own organization was matched by his private amazement at discovering that reputation could become reality when sufficient numbers of people accepted fictional versions of events as accurate descriptions of what had actually occurred. The bounty that accompanied his new status represented validation of achievements that he himself was not entirely certain he had actually accomplished, though his pragmatic nature led him to accept such recognition as opportunity to be leveraged rather than mistake to be corrected through embarrassing revelations that would undermine whatever advantages his enhanced reputation might provide. The psychological adjustment required for embracing role as one of the world's most feared pirates was complicated by his honest understanding of his own limitations, though his experience with performing various personas throughout his career had prepared him for challenges that leadership at such levels inevitably created. The relationship with his crew that evolved during this transition period revealed depths of loyalty that had been building through years of shared adventure and mutual support. Their willingness to follow him into increasingly dangerous situations, reflecting not blind faith in his infallibility, but mature understanding of his genuine capabilities, balanced against realistic assessment of what they could collectively achieve when circumstances favored their particular approach to overcoming obstacles. The organizational structure that emerged from this period emphasized delegation and specialization in ways that maximized everyone's contributions, while ensuring that leadership decisions were informed by input from those whose expertise exceeded his own in specific areas. The hunt for the One Piece that Cross Guild had officially joined represented return to dreams that had sustained him since childhood, though his current understanding of what such treasure might actually represent had evolved considerably from the simple monetary wealth that had originally motivated his interest in becoming pirate. The knowledge he possessed regarding the final island's location, through his connection to the Roger Pirates, created advantages that his allies valued highly, while the emotional significance of potentially completing journey that his former captain had begun added personal dimensions that transcended whatever material rewards might await successful completion of such unprecedented quest. The irony that his accidental rise to power had positioned him as legitimate contender for title that represented culmination of every dream he had harbored since youth was not lost on someone whose entire career had been characterized by achievements that seemed to violate normal relationships between effort and reward. The possibility that he might actually become Pirate King through combination of luck and strategic positioning rather than overwhelming personal strength provided daily amusement while simultaneously creating pressure to live up to expectations that his reputation had generated among those who viewed him as genuine threat to their own ambitions. The philosophy that had emerged from his unique experiences emphasized adaptability and persistence over rigid planning or overwhelming force. His understanding that circumstances could change with bewildering rapidity, making flexibility more valuable than any specific capability that might prove irrelevant when situations developed in unexpected directions. The lessons he had learned through decades of surviving encounters with opponents whose power exceeded his own had taught him that victory was often achieved by those who remained standing when others had fallen, rather than those who possessed superior abilities at the conflict's beginning. The current period represents a moment when dreams that had seemed impossibly distant during his youth have become achievable through pathways that no amount of planning could have anticipated. His position within Cross Guild, providing resources and allies necessary for pursuing objectives that individual effort alone could never have accomplished, while his reputation creates opportunities that would have remained closed to someone whose achievements were more conventionally impressive, but less dramatically memorable. The ship that carries him toward whatever destiny awaits continues to serve as platform for adventures that combine theatrical flair with practical effectiveness, in ways that reflect his unique understanding of how performance substance could be integrated to create results that exceeded what either approach could achieve independently. The treasure maps that line his cabin walls represent not just monetary opportunities, but tangible connections to dreams that have sustained him through every setback and disappointment his remarkable career has produced. Each chart telling story of adventure completed or promise waiting to be fulfilled when circumstances align properly. The crew that surrounds him carries within their hearts loyalty that has been earned through years of shared laughter and mutual support. Their faith in his leadership reflecting recognition that some forms of strength cannot be measured through conventional standards, but reveal themselves only when tested by challenges that demand more than individual capability alone can provide. Standing now at the pinnacle of achievement that seemed impossible when he first set sail with nothing but dreams and determination, Buggy the Clown represents perfect synthesis of ambition and absurdity, that makes him perhaps the most unlikely yet fitting candidate for inheriting legacy that began with declaration that dreams could never die as long as people possessed courage to pursue them. Despite overwhelming evidence that success was impossible for anyone who lacked supernatural gifts or inherited advantages, his red nose glowing in morning sunlight as he contemplates horizons that continue promising adventures whose outcomes will be determined not by careful planning, but by his remarkable ability to transform accidents into opportunities and defeats into foundations for greater victories that logic cannot explain but experience has taught him to expect. In the grand tapestry of maritime politics, where individual ambitions intersect with governmental necessities to create arrangements that serve purposes far beyond their apparent simplicity, the institution known as the Seven Warlords of the Sea emerged as perhaps the most audacious experiment in managed chaos that any ruling authority had ever dared to implement on such a scale. This system, which would endure for decades, while reshaping the fundamental nature of how piracy and legitimate governance could coexist within frameworks that satisfied neither side, completely yet provided benefits that made continued cooperation preferable to the alternatives that open warfare would inevitably produce, represented recognition by the world government that some problems could not be solved through conventional application of military force, but required more subtle approaches that acknowledged realities they preferred not to publicly admit. The conception of this unprecedented arrangement emerged from practical recognition that the naval resources available to world government authorities, while impressive by any conventional measure, remained insufficient for the task of simultaneously maintaining order across all the territories under their theoretical jurisdiction, while suppressing pirate activities that operated according to no centralized command structure and could therefore adapt to enforcement efforts with speed and creativity that formal military organizations struggled to match. The mathematics of the situation was stark and unforgiving. For every pirate crew that marine forces successfully eliminated, 3 more seemed to emerge from populations that viewed such outlaws as heroes rather than criminals. Their romanticized perception of pirate life, creating recruitment pipeline that could not be disrupted through simple arrest and punishment of individual violators. The strategic framework that eventually evolved into the formal warlord system was built upon recognition that certain exceptionally powerful pirates represented resources that could be redirected toward governmental purposes rather than obstacles that needed to be eliminated at costs that would drain treasuries and manpower beyond sustainable levels. The logic was elegantly simple in conception, though dauntingly complex in implementation. If pirates were an inevitable feature of maritime civilization, then the most dangerous among them should be transformed into assets rather than remaining as threats, their strength channeled toward purposes that served official interests, while their continued existence as pirates satisfied populations that required such figures for cultural and psychological reasons that extended far beyond simple criminal activity. The 3 great powers structure that emerged from these considerations represented delicate balance between forces whose natural inclinations pushed them toward conflict with each other, the Marines providing official law enforcement, while the 4 emperors represented uncontrolled pirate power that could not be directly challenged without triggering wars that might destroy the very territories that government claimed to protect. The warlords occupied the crucial middle ground between these extremes, serving as buffer zone that prevented direct confrontation, while simultaneously providing mechanism through which pirate activities could be regulated without requiring the kind of total victory that military commanders preferred. But political leaders understood was neither achievable nor necessarily desirable given the broader implications of what complete elimination of piracy would mean for societies that had organized themselves around its existence. The recruitment process that identified suitable candidates for warlord status required careful evaluation of factors that extended far beyond simple combat effectiveness to encompass political reliability, territorial influence, and psychological makeup that would allow individuals whose entire careers had been built upon defiance of authority to accept collaboration with systems they had previously opposed. The ideal warlord possessed strength sufficient to command respect from other pirates while maintaining enough pragmatic flexibility to honor agreements with government representatives whose own positions required demonstrable results that could be presented to superiors who measured success through statistics rather than nuanced understanding of how complex relationships actually functioned in practice. The benefits that warlord status provided were carefully calibrated to offer genuine value while maintaining dependency that prevented complete independence from government oversight. The legal immunity and territorial autonomy that came with such recognition being balanced against obligations that ensured continued cooperation through mechanisms that were more sophisticated than simple contract enforcement. The psychological satisfaction of official recognition appealed to individuals whose careers had been spent operating outside legitimate society, while the practical advantages of reduced marine harassment allowed them to pursue personal objectives with greater efficiency than would have been possible under constant pressure from law enforcement agencies whose resources were redirected toward more pressing threats. The early years of the system's operation revealed both its potential effectiveness and the fundamental contradictions that would eventually undermine its stability. The success stories demonstrating how former enemies could become valuable allies, while the failures highlighted dangers inherent in trusting individuals whose loyalty was secured through incentives rather than genuine conversion to gobernamental principios. The most successful warlords were those who understood that their new status represented opportunity rather than constraint. Their ability to leverage official recognition for purposes that served both their personal interests and broader governmental objectives, creating relationships that benefited all parties involved, while the problematic cases typically emerged from misunderstanding about what kinds of behavior would be tolerated under arrangements that required flexibility from all participants. The geographical distribution of warlord territories created informal network of government-allied bases that provided strategic depth and intelligence-gathering capabilities that conventional military installations could never have achieved. Their integration into local power structures, allowing them to gather information and influence events in ways that official representatives would have found impossible to accomplish. The economic benefits that flowed from legitimate trade relationships and reduced piracy in protected waters demonstrated tangible value that could be quantified and presented to skeptical officials who questioned whether collaborating with criminals could ever serve legitimate governmental purposes, though such calculations necessarily ignored moral considerations that some viewed as more important than mere practical effectiveness. The corruption that inevitably accompanied such arrangements was both predictable and manageable within limits that most participants found acceptable. The understanding that certain amount of illegal activity would be overlooked in exchange for cooperation in matters that authorities considered more important, creating flexibility that allowed the system to function despite contradictions that pure legalists found intolerable. The key to maintaining balance lay in ensuring that warlord activities that violated official policy remained sufficiently discreet that they could be ignored without creating political embarrassment for government officials whose careers depended upon maintaining appearance of moral authority while achieving practical results. that often required moral compromises. Don Quixote do Flamingo's manipulation of his warlord status represented perhaps the most sophisticated abuse of the system's inherent vulnerabilities. His use of blackmail and insider knowledge to maintain protection while engaging in activities that directly contradicted the purposes that warlord appointments were supposed to serve. His success in maintaining his position despite behavior that should have resulted in immediate expulsion demonstrated how thoroughly he understood the political dynamics that made government officials reluctant to admit mistakes or confront problems that had become too complex to resolve through simple administrative action. His expertise in exploiting bureaucratic inertia and institutional face-saving, creating protection that exceeded what his combat abilities alone could have provided. The intelligence networks that several warlords maintained provided valuable early warning systems that allowed government forces to respond to threats before they could develop into full-scale crises, though the reliability of such information was complicated by recognition that their sources had their own agendas that might not align perfectly with official interests. The most valuable intelligence often came from warlords, whose territorial holdings placed them in positions to observe activities that conventional surveillance methods could not effectively monitor. Their integration into criminal networks, providing access to information that would have been impossible to obtain through formal channels that operated according to legal constraints. The military effectiveness of the system was demonstrated during several major conflicts where warlord participation proved decisive in achieving governmental objectives that might otherwise have required significantly greater resource, expenditure and casualties among official forces. Their unique capabilities and territorial positions, allowing them to contribute specialized services that conventional military units could not provide. The Marineford War represented perhaps the most dramatic example of how warlord involvement could influence outcomes of conflicts whose stakes extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations. Though the mixed loyalties that several displayed during that crisis also highlighted fundamental weaknesses that would eventually lead to the system's dissolution. The psychological impact of the warlord system on broader pirate populations was complex and often contradictory. Their official recognition, providing evidence that cooperation with government authorities was possible, while simultaneously creating resentment among those who viewed such arrangements as betrayal of principles that piracy was supposed to represent. The younger generation of pirates who grew up during the system's operation developed attitudes toward authority and legitimacy that differed significantly from their predecessors. Their understanding that power could be exercised through official channels, as well as criminal activity, creating possibilities for career paths that previous generations had never considered available to individuals with their backgrounds and inclinations. The economic disruption caused by certain warlord activities created tensions that ultimately proved more damaging to the system's long-term viability than any military threats they faced from conventional pirate opposition. The underground networks that some maintained generating profits that competed directly with legitimate businesses, while their official protection made conventional law enforcement responses impossible. The slave trading that several engaged in represented particularly problematic area, where their activities directly contradicted governmental policies that were considered fundamental to international relations and domestic political stability, though the difficulty of obtaining evidence that could be used in official proceedings meant that such violations often went unpunished until political considerations made action unavoidable. The Leverley decision that ultimately abolished the warlord system emerged from combination of practical problems that had become impossible to ignore and political pressures that reflected changing attitudes toward what kinds of compromises were acceptable in pursuit of governmental objectives. The representatives of member nations, concluding that whatever benefits the arrangement provided were outweighed by costs that included both direct damage from warlord activities and indirect harm to governmental credibility that resulted from public knowledge of collaboration with individuals whose behavior contradicted official principles. The debate that preceded this decision revealed fundamental disagreements about priorities and methods that had been papered over during the system's operation, but could no longer be avoided when its continuation required explicit reauthorization. The immediate aftermath of abolition created chaos that demonstrated how thoroughly the global balance of power had become dependent upon arrangements that most participants had taken for granted. The sudden elimination of legal protections, forcing former warlords to make rapid decisions about how to respond to changed circumstances, while government forces scrambled to develop alternative approaches to problems that the system had been managing through unofficial channels. The formation of Cross Guild represented one of several organizational responses that emerged as former warlords sought to maintain capabilities and territories they had developed during their period of official recognition, while adapting to environments where such activities would no longer receive government protection. The development of Seraphim and other SSG weapons represented governmental attempt to replace warlord capabilities through technological solutions that would provide similar benefits without political complications that human allies inevitably created, though the effectiveness of such alternatives remained unproven and their costs were substantially higher than maintaining relationships with individuals whose loyalty could be secured through arrangements that required no initial investment in research and development. The strategic implications of relying upon technological rather than human assets included vulnerabilities that enemy forces might exploit, as well as dependencies upon manufacturing and maintenance capabilities that could be disrupted through methods that were ineffective against human operatives. The long-term consequences of the system's abolition continued to ripple through global power structures in ways that government planners had not fully anticipated. The elimination of buffer zone between official authority and uncontrolled pirate power, creating instabilities that required new approaches to management, while former warlords pursued objectives that were no longer constrained by even nominal governmental oversight. The lesson that emerged from this experience was that institutional arrangements, which evolved to serve specific purposes, could not be eliminated without understanding how their functions would be replaced. The assumption that superior alternatives existed proving inadequate foundation for policy changes, whose effects would influence international relations for decades to come. Standing now as historical artifact whose influence continues to shape contemporary events through consequences that its creators never anticipated, the Seven Warlords of the Sea system represented both remarkable achievement in practical politics and cautionary example of how expedient solutions to immediate problems could create larger complications that would eventually require resolution through methods that were far more costly than the original challenges would have demanded, if addressed through more principled approaches that prioritized long-term stability over short-term convenience. The Seven Warlords of the Sea, though officially disbanded, continue to shape the world through their actions, their teachings, and their enduring influence on those who encountered them. From Mihawk's unwavering pursuit of strength to Kuma's selfless sacrifice, from Hancock's fierce protection of her people to Crocodile's relentless ambition, each warlord embodied different aspects of what it means to wield power in a world where might and ideology clash. Their stories remind us that strength comes in many forms: the cutting edge of a master's blade, the revolutionary's willingness to sacrifice everything for others, the love that transforms hatred into protection. As the world moves toward its final confrontation between freedom and control, The lessons learned from these 7 pirates who walked between worlds continue to echo. Rest now, gentle dreamer, knowing that even in a world of pirates and marines, emperors and revolutionaries, the choices we make in how we use our strength define not just our own destiny, but the legacy we leave for those who come after. The sea remembers all stories, and the greatest tales are those of hearts that refuse to compromise their deepest convictions.